The story begins with the cruelty of the reality of the war, the same bloody battle, which was forever imprinted in memory as a confrontation with the Murim, who betrayed the alliance. The defenders did not understand when this ruthless onslaught of warriors would end. Enemy fighters moved like shadows of the night. Like skilled ninja, they sunk silently to their victims, ready to strike a deadly blow. The last of the defenders stood unshakably to the very end. His will did not know the boundaries. However, the opponents seemed to be neither the end nor the edge. The endless sea of enemies extended before his eyes. The warrior carefully watched the leader of the alliance, a man who led this bloody operation. No one could imagine that after the conclusion of the Union agreement, they would be hit directly in the back in such an insidious way. The fact that they protected was dear to the heart of their lord, so the brave warrior ordered his comrades to hold on. After all, the help was already hurrying to them on dusty roads. However, the alliance people only mockingly laughed at these words of hope. Then, with contempt, several severed heads threw to the ground. These were the heads of the very people whom the fighters expected as a saving reinforcement. So the defenders learned the terrible truth. All their reinforcements were destroyed, and the chance of survival melted like morning fog. The first sword, the leader of the Alliant Murim, only enjoyed the unfolding situation. He was even somewhat sad. The power of the legendary ice pavilion did not live up to his high expectations. But despite the disappointment, he praised the fighters for at least trying to provide some kind of resistance. After these mocking words, a snow-free fighter only bitterly laughed at the self-confidence of the enemy. If this arrogant leader met face-to-face with their true master, he would definitely have serious problems. The Alliance fighters became furious of the arrogance that this foreign warrior allowed themselves. They viciously warned the captive that for such impudent words against their master, they would definitely not forgive him and kill him with their own hands, without trembling. However, at this critical second, a young girl ran out of the camping cart, who imploringly asked the fighters to stop bloodshed. Of course, the guard tried to keep Madame Swine from rash acts, but she knew that they had nothing to worry about at the moment. At the same moment, the leader of the alliance coldly ordered his fighters to retreat back. The girl resolutely went straight to her father. The man was covered by a violent anger. Not only did these despicable monkeys deceive him, so his daughter also escaped from his own house against his will. He had never been so humiliated by such behavior. However, the father promised that he would forgive the naughty daughter. After all, everyone makes mistakes in their life. Therefore, he generously gives her a chance to return home. The man sincerely hoped that the girl would be smart enough to make the only right choice. But she was worried about the fate of these people. She desperately wanted them to survive. According to the only look of the leader of the alliance, it was quite obvious. He was not going to have mercy on anyone. Therefore, all that was left to do the unfortunate bump is to persuade his head in humility and apologize to the angry father. Then he resolutely took up the handle of the sword, perfectly understanding what should happen next. The man was obliged to wash away the shame of the family, so with his own hands he deprived his only daughter. Faithful guards, unfortunately, did not arrive in time to the place of the tragedy, although they would prefer to die themselves instead of their mistress. The ruthless leader of the alliance himself retired from the place of execution quite calmly, warning all those present that he had never had a daughter. After all, she fell under the harmful influence of wild orcs. Now they had only one sacred mission: to return the soul of the Central Plains under control. Therefore, he impassively ordered his fighters to restore the proper order in this damned place. And so even a more bloody massacre began than before. All the soldiers fought until the very last breath, and the dying girl watched this terrifying sight. Of course, Brian desperately wanted to go back home, to the arms of a peaceful life. At the last moment of her existence, she remembered her lover with pain, mentally apologizing that she could not keep the solemn promise given to him. In this heavy rain, under the sparkling lightning of heavenly anger, she vowed the next time to return to him alive and unharmed. Soon, one of the few survivors hurried to the palace in order to tell about the tragedy that had happened. The owner of the majestic palace of the North Sea, the powerful Salt of Mudon, could not restrain his righteous anger, hearing this terrible news. The assistant in a trembling voice explained that all members of the ice pavilion, including the mistress, who went as a messenger to conclude peace negotiations with a combat alliance, encountered the treacherous murder of the Murim alliance. As a result, they were all ruthlessly destroyed. The rage which the powerful hero experienced had no bounds. He almost killed his faithful assistants, standing next to him at that moment. After that, Vladika rose from his throne, realizing that he could not forgive these insidious people. He vowed to erase all the traitors to one from the face of the earth. So the angry ruler ordered his invincible army to prepare for the performance. They had to immediately go to the Central Plains and punish the perpetrators right now. Soon, formidable forces met in a decisive battle with the leader of the insidious alliance and his minions. A very wounded man did not doomedly looked at the battlefield, bitterly realizing that all his people were completely destroyed. His inner power was also finally exhausted. That was his inevitable end. In the end, the traitor simply imploringly looked at the Lord of the North Sea Palace, asking him to end his sufferings. However, at first the hero wanted to know the truth. Why did this cruel man kill his own daughter? For what sins did she deserve such a fate? From such a stupid, according to the dying man, he even laughed bitterly. Then he explained with contempt. He could not forgive his daughter for falling in love with such a barbarian, like Salt Mudon. It was a huge mistake, to leave it alive after such a shame. The hero fell silent gloomily and prepared to kill this dishonorable man. And in the end he only laughed viciously. After all, let the hero capture the whole world with his strength. But he can never get what he wanted more than anything else. So the leader of the damned alliance was finally destroyed. It was hard for him to believe that everything would end in this way. In the last moments of life, he recalled his little daughter, painfully wanting to know. Why did she betray her own father, and contacted the despicable barber? At that fateful moment when he killed her, the man was in a state of real blind rage. So on this mournful night, with the death of the leader of the alliance, the great bloody battle, which lasted for 6 months, finally approached its end. And the living legend of the North Sea, the invincible master Salt Mudon, became an indisputable ruler of the Central Plains. However, the winner did not show any emotions of the triumph. He simply quietly looked away at the pale moon, immersed in heavy thoughts about the meaning of life and the price of victory. Soon, returning to his home, Vladika sat at the table, thoughtfully examining a small, delicate flower. Now this fragile flower of love was the only thing that he had in memory of the road of bumps. The powerful warrior recalled that bright moment that occurred some time ago. The joyful bump brought the hero a flower of love which finally blossomed in all its glory. This magic flower could blossom only when two really love each other with sincere love. She even cried with happiness, explaining that she had never doubted the feelings of the Lord. It was just painful that this symbol of their love did not bloom for so long. But now the girl understood. It was not just one-sided affection. Salt Mudon also sincerely loved her with all his heart. The hero only hugged his dear lover tightly, not understanding how one could not fall in love with such an amazing woman like her. Then, looking at how immensely happy his chosen one was, Salt Mudon experienced deep gratitude to this magic flower. And now everything that he wanted more than anything else is to fill the whole world with the flowers of love for the sake of his late bride. For years have passed since her tragic death. But no matter how desperately he tried, the hero could not forget the bums. However, in this fateful second, right on his amazed eyes, the flower of love suddenly blossomed again with a bright, dazzling light. For this incredible reason, Salt Mudon immediately called his faithful assistant. Vladika gave a strict order, to find the sage who can explain what had just happened before his eyes. It was necessary to find this person, even if you have to search all the Central Plains or the whole famous world. A few days of waiting passed since that memorable evening. A mysterious reconnaissance sect gathered in the house of Vladika, whose members knew everything in the world. Of course, they were extremely interested in what on earth the divine palace of the North Sea called them. But suddenly everyone heard a loud sound, as if emanating right from heaven. No one understood what was happening at that moment. The wise old people decided to go outside in order to find out the cause of the strange phenomenon. However, instead of explanation, they saw a striking sight. A huge garden was literally dotted with beautiful colors of unprecedented beauty. Of course, all of them for the first time in their lives saw a garden filled with colors of love after all. Such a magical flower is extremely difficult to see, even only one in life. The sacred symbol of love literally covered every stem in the garden. These were undoubtedly real flowers of love. It was incredibly interesting to everyone. How could there be so many rare colors of this kind in one place? The hero, going up to the amazed men from the back, realized that he could hit their imagination with a similar picture. Then he introduced himself as the owner of this magic garden, Salt Mudon. The frightened old people wanted to know why the absolute ruler of the Central Plain decided to call them here. Then Salt Mudon patiently explained, all this amazing garden was filled with colors of love. He and his beloved forced these flowers to bloom with the power of their mutual love, but when the girl died dear to her heart, the whole garden also died from grief. However, for some mysterious reason a few days ago, the garden was revived to life. It was extremely difficult to believe in it, but it was pure truth. The situation was quite extraordinary and mystical. However, one of the experienced historians had a possible explanation of what was happening. He explained with trepidation, the soul of a lover could be revived in a new body. In other words, reincarnation occurred. So, apparently, his love was born somewhere in this world precisely at the moment when he bloomed a magic flower. If his opinion is erroneous, then another reasonable explanation for this phenomenon simply cannot exist. Mudon Salt did not even bother the fact that it sounds somewhat absurd, because he finally had a long-awaited hope. As you know, he managed to win the Central Plains and unite the entire region, fulfilling the long-standing desire of the North Sea. However, despite all the grandiose achievements and glory, only oppressive emptiness remained inside the hero's soul. The North Sea flourished and grew strongly every day, and its longing for the road only grew and intensified. He lost her forever, and did not see any more reason to live further in this world. Therefore, now Vladika decided to ask the wise men, how can he find his precious bride in a new embodiment? Then the old people remembered the ancient belief. The flower of love fades and loses its light when two lovers are at a great distance from each other. Therefore, when the owner of the palace finds his reincarnated lover, the flower of love shines even brighter than the former. Previously, Salt Mudon did not even know about this secret. However, recalling the moment when Quan brought this flower, he really shone very vividly by divine light. The sages also explained that it will be extremely difficult and impractical to carry a living flower on the trip. They suggested turning the flower of love into a precious decoration in order to carry it with you everywhere. As a result, the hero decided to entrust this important task to experienced old people, and warned, he will go on a long journey in 10 days, so by this time all preparations should be completely completed. Vladika also promised, if everything passes successfully, he will award each of them with hundreds of gold coins for labors. After that, the hero left the meeting, going to prepare for the upcoming fateful mission. Salt Mudon still could not fully believe that hope for a meeting with bums really exists. After all, he believed that he would never see her again in this life. The hero vowed not to leave this precious hope. Wherever his lover may be, he will follow her even in the very depths of hell. All that he prayed about fate was so that the girl waited for him in this new incarnation. Soon, the most important part of the entire mission came. The journey and the search for a lover around the world. At some point, the wanderers reached the very edge of the famous continent. It was the last region that they had not yet searched. The mysterious Hainan extended in front of them. 3 long years have passed, and 5 months since the hero began to look for his precious lover around the world. But, having searched the entire central part of the mainland, he could not find her. For the whole time that they were looking for the reincarnation of bums, the young man went an incredible development path, from the level of transformation to the deep level of skill, and twice survived a complete spiritual metamorphosis. Now the hero intuitively understood. The bumpy was probably here in these unknown lands. Then he tightly squeezed a crystal in his hand, created from a flower of love, recalling their last conversations. Then Salt Mudon begged the girl not to leave the safe house. However, her father was going to take part in decisive negotiations. And if she goes there, she will definitely explain the true intentions of the hero. Of course, Salt Mudon persistently repeated that it was an obvious trap of enemies. But Quan desperately wanted to trust her native father, no matter what. Looking at how the girl sincerely asks him to trust her decision, the hero no longer doubted. As a result, he agreed to release his lover. However, the young man asked if the girl, God forbid, feels something was amiss. She needed to run away and save her life without the slightest thought. Before leaving, the girl wanted to give Salt to Mudon something important and expensive to the heart. It was a jewelry left by her deceased mother. Mom told her that this necklace has the ability to return to the one who gave it from a pure heart. She sincerely believed this magic necklace will always direct Mudon's Salt back to her wherever she was. After that, the girl with a radiant smile asked him not to worry in vain, because she would never leave him of her own free will. Now the hero understood with pain. He needed to stop his lover at that fateful moment, and not let her go anywhere. According to the sea, where they sailed on the ship, a cruel storm suddenly began, because of which several sailors almost fell overboard from pitching. Even the experienced Salt of Mudon was surprised by such a sudden natural disaster. But soon he saw how a huge wave was preparing to collapse on them, completely covering their fragile ship. The hero immediately released his protective internal energy, using a powerful technique of a 1,000-kilogram hammer. However, this technique was enough to protect only himself and those who stood nearby. As a result, some sailors with desperate cries of horror climbed overboard into the raging abyss. Looking at this disaster, the hero understood he urgently needed to do something to save people. He applied his strength of telekinesis and tore off several boards from the deck. throwing them into the water so that sinking people could grab them. So far, this has been enough for temporary salvation. But this was not the most important problem. The wave rushing on them was now even larger and more formidable than the former. The hero anxiously understood that his ship would no longer withstand such destructive blows of the elements. He had no choice but to try to stop the wave itself. And in this critical second, everyone felt how the air around sharply became colder. Seawater began to freeze rapidly. As it turned out, the hero used the legendary technique of the ice dragon so that the giant wave passes past them without harm. And at the same moment, he noticed something strange. His necklace, for the first time in a long time, shone brightly with a mystical light. This light was so bright and piercing that he blinded his eyes. It seemed that it was coming straight from the sky, and soon the storm passed as if it were not at all. Opening their eyes, everyone on the deck looked at the distant mysterious islands, anticipating that their long searches are finally coming to an end. By the time the Salt, Mudon, was conscious, he was surprised to realize that he was in some unfamiliar place. Everything that has been preserved in his memory is a desperate struggle against the sea storm. The young man could not remember how he got into this strange place. However, suddenly the air was torn by the loud cries of horror, rushing from somewhere out of the wagon. People in a panic ran away from giant insects of unprecedented sizes that attacked them without warning. The crowd panicked, not knowing how to cope with these monstrous creatures. But suddenly the hero, cutting everything in his path, came out of his wagon and began to look around what was happening around. It seemed to him that he somehow hit the dense forest somewhere on the central plains. But unexpectedly, for the first time in my life, I saw people with colored eyes. One of the distinguishing features of Western people according to ancient traditions. This meant only one thing: he was far enough from his home. At this moment, huge flies flew into the Lord himself. From the surprise of their monstrous size, the hero experienced a strong shock. As a result, realizing that it was necessary to defeat these creatures, the powerful warrior applied the divine ice shot. A huge fly instantly froze, and after it was torn into small particles. Salt Mudon was clearly angry. Some simple creature dared to attack him only because it increased in size. He definitely could not forgive such impudence. After that, the Vladica rose into the air, destroying all other insects who dared to threaten human lives. At the same time, the hero did not even use some particularly strong technique. Even his usual ice shot was enough to cope with these worthless bees. With his incredible skill, he forced local residents to open their mouths from amazement. Before they did not see such magic, and this seemed to them a real miracle. After the battle was completed, these people began to discuss something lively in a foreign language completely incomprehensible to the Salt. The hero did not understand their speech, bewildered. An elderly man who introduced himself as Edmund, the head of the local trading guild, approached him. Having bowed with respect, the old man thanked the hero for the salvation of the lives of people, and wanted to know the name of this powerful master. Of course, Salt Mudon understood that they expressed something similar to gratitude, but did not know how to explain that he did not understand their light-eyed adverb. Therefore, the warrior wanted to find out, is anyone talking here in the language of the Central Plain? As a result, the bewildered foreigners began to discuss something excitedly among themselves. Salt Mudon was sincerely struck by the fact that none of these people knew his native language, Central Plains. It was extremely difficult for him because he fell into a situation when he could not really explain anything. At that moment, his assistant ran up to the man, who handed him a large magic ring. Edmund immediately put it on his finger, and his whole body shone with a golden haze. After that, the merchant masterfully made a spectacular pose, like a star of some popular performance, and calmly turned to the hero, hoping that now he could understand their speech. Salt Mudon was struck by the fact that the old man suddenly began to speak freely in the language of the Central Plains, but they kindly explained to him that it was the magical power of such a ring, an artifact of the translation of languages. After that, Edmund introduced himself again and again, thanked the hero for the salvation of the guild members. Then I decided to find out what their name is: the Valiant Savior, a magical swordsman. The warrior did not have the slightest concept, which means the term magic swordsman, but honestly introduced himself as his name, not mentioning his titles and status. Edmund undertook to explain. Magic swordsmen are people who skillfully use the sword and magic together, as Salt Mudon just demonstrated. However, the hero even had no idea what kind of magic is talking about in these words. Foreigners were amazed. A man who had just shot ice before their eyes had no idea what magic is. The old man was extremely interesting to understand where this mysterious man came from. Edmund was even difficult to imagine where to start a conversation in such an unusual situation. However, Salt Mudon was angry with the fact that no one answered his question about this strange, as they said, magic. The old man only became convinced that the man in front of him is clearly some kind of strange and, possibly, a little crazy. But the merchant hoped that after a detailed explanation of what magic is, the stranger's violent temper would calm down a little. Therefore, in fright, he decided to explain everything from the very beginning. So soon the young man realized that in this part of the world there was something under the name magic. After this discovery, he calmed down sharply, only realizing that the world was much more and more mysterious than he meant earlier. At this moment, Edmund became extremely interesting. Where is this mysterious place called Central Plains? Where is their savior come from? This question was already surprised by the youngest warrior. He was struck by the fact that people living here do not even know where this region is located. The hero made it clear that it is very strange to ask where the Central Plains are located when they are in these lands. Then Edmund patiently explained to the swordsman that this place was by no means the Central Plains. It was a dense forest on the way to a dunes, the capital of the kingdom of Drake. It was extremely difficult for them to understand each other, because the hero has never heard in his entire life that someone called the Central Plains with some other name. Although Edmund did not look so old, Salt Mudon suspected that the old man clearly had problems with his mind. The merchant only explained that he was only 50 years old. He was more worried about the strange Salt of Mudon, who continued to stubbornly insist that this place was the Central Plains. As a result, in order to resolve their dispute once and for all, Salt Mudon decided to ask the boy who watched them all this time because of the tree. Edmund was even surprised, not understanding how young Leo was there. Salt Mudon himself, without wasting time in vain, decided to find out from the boy what kind of place is Central Plains, Drick, or something completely different. However, the child did not reply that the beginning was even more anger. But Edmund reminded the hero that the boy simply could not understand his words because of the language barrier. Therefore, the merchant decided to transfer the translation ring to the warrior. After Salt Mudon put on an artifact, he had to activate it with the help of magical words of interpretation of languages. Of course, the man understood that this was a waste to provide such an expensive magic to such a strange madman. But he could not allow the Salt to Mudon to continue to treat him as a demented old man. Shortly after the pronounced team, the hero's hand shone brightly with a mystical light. A lot of symbols from different languages of the world appeared around her. To surprise, now the warrior began to hear and understand what blue-eyed people say. This spell was really incredible in its strength. As the hero promised, he turned to the boy in order to find out what his name is, and then decided to also ask, "Are they here in the Central Plains?" However, it seems that little Leo, even this name was completely unknown. He calmly explained that this is a dense forest located on the way to the dungeon, the capital of the kingdom of Drake. Salt Mudon could not believe it, considering that this child also had problems with reason. He even suspected that someone asked this baby to answer in this way. However, the old man invited the hero to ask any person in the guild. He would have received exactly the same answer from everyone. Salt Mudon understood that since Edmund was so confident in his words, he was unlikely to lie. So he really was not on the Central Plains, as he initially believed. The warrior began to recall intensely what happened before that moment. Everything that has been preserved in memory is that he fought on a ship with a sea element to the very end. But when he opened his eyes, he was already in a wagon on land. Perhaps at that fateful moment when he fought with giant waves, in some mysterious way he moved in space. When awareness came to him, the hero also felt some strange pain in the chest area. This unusual feeling was right in his denge, the center of internal energy. The energy that circulated in his body now was radically different from everything that he had ever experienced before. This made him understand that something unusual happened to his body definitely. After which the warrior got up and retired from the crowd. He needed to make sure that he felt. In this world he felt some other, more pure energy, which was definitely different from the usual energy of the Central Plains. For this reason, the hero took off high into the air in order to look around and better understand the surrounding area. After that, he collected all the energy inside his chest, concentrating it in his energy core. And then he tried to release with one powerful impulse. To its amazement, the amount of accumulated and released energy has doubled compared to the usual amount. But the warrior still did not understand why he ended up here, and not in the Central Plains, as was supposed to occur. Perhaps all this was due to the bright light, which at the fatal moment emanated from his necklace. Brain once said that this jewelry can return to the one who gave it from a pure heart. In this case, he probably arrived here because he should meet her here. The hero was sure she was probably somewhere in another foreign world. At this time, the head of the merchants did not understand where their mysterious savior went. And when Salt Mudon returned, Edmund demanded that the hero explain the cause of his sudden disappearance. He only looked around in surprise, seeing that everyone had gathered around him with restless faces. Therefore, he calmly explained he had some urgent matters, so he left for a while and now returned back. The warrior decided to clarify the question again. According to a boy named Leo, this place is called Drake. He needed to make sure that this was true. Edmund recalled that if they continue to move in the intended direction, they will be able to get to the Velvet, the capital of this kingdom. Salt Mudan, of course, did not know where this place is exactly. Therefore, one of the children suggested that their mysterious savior perhaps for many years studied in the mountains a hermit, since so little knows about the world around him. Edmund heard a lot of stories about eccentrics like the Salt of Mudan, but for the first time he saw such a person live. And the hero decided to play along with this smart baby. After all, recluse was an excellent justification for his obvious ignorance of many things. Salt Mudan really knew nothing about this world. All that he understood from the conversations is the barking is the capital of the kingdom of Drake. He needed to learn more information from these people until they dispersed about their business. Initially, seeing blue-eyed people here, the warrior thought that he had met the Western barbarians, which he had heard only in ancient stories and legends. At that moment, the boy took pity on the poor swordsman who had lived all his life in a mountain solitude, and decided to enlighten him at least a little. This inquisitive baby was the name of Luffy. Looking at their friendly conversation, Edmund was indignant, not understanding why suddenly the child became so friendly with a stranger. This strange guy seemed extremely disgusting to the merchant, because he was a completely unpredictable person. At night of the same day, Salt Mudan began to actively study this place, asking local residents about everything in a row. He could not believe it, but it turned out, this is not even the land of Western barbarians. It was a completely different, parallel world. The area looked completely unusual and mysterious. In addition, writing was radically different, not like the one that was used in the Central Plains. In this amazing world, other reasonable races lived, such as elegant elves, as well as skillful gnomes, famous for their legendary power. Also here lived races similar to beasts, hybrids of humans and animals, and the most powerful creatures of this world were ancient dragons, which were a giant winged lizards or something like that. In addition, the boy talked about magicians. Experienced wizards of the Fifth Circle and higher could use the special magic of teleportation. To do this, it was necessary to draw complex magic circles on the ground and pronounce special spells. After that, they can instantly move to where they want. They say, the better the ability of the magician, the further he can move at a time. But despite such detailed explanations of the boy, for the Salt of Mudan, magic still remained completely incomprehensible. It was extremely interesting for him to know how many more amazing things existed in this world. However, suddenly the hero drew attention to the night sky. Instead of the usual one moon, there were 3 of them here. As a result, Salt Mudan finally became convinced that it really was a completely different world that could not be found in the Central Plains. Perhaps Quan specifically called him here through the power of the cherished necklace. At that moment, the hero heard a loud male cry of horror. The noise came from the camp, and Salt Mudan immediately ran there to the aid. At this critical moment, a girl named Sabina grabbed one of the little girls hostage, instructing her a sharply sharpened blade. She hysterically ordered anyone not to get closer. Otherwise she would kill both the child and herself. Everyone desperately tried to calm the distraught Sabina, promising that as soon as they get to the capital, they could cure everyone. There were many skilled magicians in the capital, and they could ask Edmund about this favor. However, the girl objected violently, calling them fools. She recalled that in the capital, the skeletors are extremely rare, and besides, they take a lot of money for their services. Right now, the eggs of the killer beetle were actively developing in their hearts, and it is not known at what point they can turn into deadly larvae. It is unlikely that anyone can cure such an infection, even in the capital. With tears in her eyes, the girl also reminded, as soon as the eggs turn into larvae, they will tear them from the inside into pieces. So it was better to die now, while they still remain whole people. However, the hero that appeared decisively ordered her to stop immediately. He already approximately understood the situation from her desperate words. After that, the warrior applied telekinesis, gently attracting the blade from the hands of the girl, and he promised that he would cure all the infected, so they have nothing to worry about. Then he asked 2 affected girls to sit on the ground. After all, the treatment was clearly not tolerated. Edmund was amazed to learn that their mysterious guest was able to use the magic of healing. However, Salt Mudan explained, he does not understand any magic of their world. He knows about the methods of treatment from the place where he lived before, so he asked everyone to calm down while he will conduct this treatment. At this moment, Edmund clung to the hero of the hero, begging that Mr. Magic Swordsman save these unfortunate children. He could not generously repay him, but he was ready to do everything in his power if he helped him in trouble. However, the hero was going to treat it completely free of charge. The most important thing was to immediately begin the salvation of lives. Therefore, the warrior asked everyone to move back and give him space for work. And Edmund immediately drove his people and asked them to take a few steps back for security reasons. At this moment, Salt Muden, going up to a frightened girl, gently asked her not to worry much, promising that the treatment would not take much time. Then he asked both patients to close their eyes and calmly relax for the procedure. When the hero put his hands to their bodies, even the skeletons of the girls began to shine through the flesh. As mentioned earlier, insect eggs were located next to the heart. And to start successful treatment, he needed to carefully check this statement. Soon, the warrior found something extremely suspicious in 2 beating hearts. Fortunately, he was very lucky. Deadly larvae had not yet managed to hatch from eggs. Now the hero needed to carefully control his internal energy so as to completely burn these parasitic eggs, without harming the most important organ. After that, Salt Mudon launched his healing energy inside the bodies, which is why the organs brightly shone with a mystical light. Soon the girls felt an intense heat that spreads throughout the body. The hero removed his hands from their back and explained with a satisfied smile that now they are completely healed. He destroyed all the eggs of insects without exception. Now patients can be completely calm and nothing terrible will happen. Of course, Edmund was extremely difficult to believe that Sabina and Anna would really be safe after such a quick treatment. However, the hero confidently promised that nothing threatens them more. In addition, there will be no side effects from the procedure, and they have nothing to worry about. Immediately, both girls began to shower the hero with sincere thanks, calling him their savior. And also all those present in the camp bowed to his invaluable service. Salt Mudon, saying goodbye to everyone, calmly went to lie down near the tree and think about everything that happened today. It was really a long and eventful day. In addition, he missed his beloved more than usual, hoping that soon they would be able to meet and live happily, as it was in the old days. Soon the whole caravan continued his journey to the capital of the magnificent kingdom. The weather turned out to be unbearably hot, so much that all travelers began to spin from the heat. Even a hero, not accustomed to such a scorching climate, has already begun to bury abundantly later. Seeing the sufferers suffering, good Luffy gave the young man his flask of water. The flask was slightly warm and obviously could not truly refresh him in such a heat. Therefore, Salt Mudon decided to release a little to his cold internal energy into the water. Thanking the boy, he explained that with the help of his water, he felt a little better. Just at the second when the hero drank, Luffy heard a strange sound from his flask, as if there was something hard and crispy there. And when Salt Mudon returned the flask to him in his hands, the child realized that she was literally icy to the touch. But as soon as he drank this wonderful water, he felt just perfectly and incredibly fresh. The hero with sincere joy looked at how the boy enjoys simple cold water. At this moment, the baby appealed to the master with a magic swordsman with a request, literally shining with delight. He asked the man to freeze his flask completely, so that he could freshen up properly. Of course, this child gave the Salt to Mudon a great honor with his training, so the warrior could at least do it for him. Without even touching the flask, at a distance he turned all the water into perfect ice. However, this short performance attracted the close attention of many people in the caravan. Everyone gathered around the hero with his flasks, begging that he also cooled them with magic. Soon, all travelers already with pleasure sipped ice water, refreshing them to the very bone. Of course, Salt Mudon was not difficult to do something similar. However, it seemed to him that the fulfillment of this simple request would entail even more unexpected problems in the future. At this moment, noticing a similar noise among his comrades, and curious Edmund also approached them. He was clearly interested in why all the travelers crowded around their dear guest. Then Luffy enthusiastically explained that Mr. Magic Mosk made his water ice, and everyone who saw it also wanted to refresh in this way. For some reason, at first glance it seemed that Edmund did not like it at all. The hero was even slightly alerted, thinking that he might have done something inappropriate. However, the next second, the merchant fell to his knees, begging that the hero cooled the water too. Salt Mudon was struck by how sincerely the man turned out to be a man for such a petty service. As a result, the warrior decided not to refuse him and refresh his water as well, because so far the Salt of Mudon was worth being with a guild and studying this mysterious world. They helped him solve the main problem, the language barrier. It was the lesser that he could do for them in return. Edmund, with great gratitude, finally tasted the magic water. However, the next second he felt something extremely unusual. The merchant was incredibly interesting. How did Mr. Magic Mosk manage to produce this ice? In fact, the ice turned out to be amazingly tasty. Earlier, Edmund tried all types of ice that were sold on the continent, but he tried so exquisitely tasty for the first time in his life. It was a really different level of quality. It was even impossible to compare with everything else. Mudon's salt was clearly surprised by the words of the merchant because he simply froze ordinary water. Hardly after that she could have some special taste. But, as Edmund explained, when creating ice, magicians usually use the cold properties of mana in the air to either freeze water directly or collect moisture from the atmosphere. During this complex process, impurities of their own mana are added to control, and they radically change the taste of the ice itself. However, since each wizard has different tendencies for mana and its properties, few can prepare really clean ice without extraneous flavors. But the ice created by Salt Mudon was incredibly clean and transparent, so it turned out to be so tasty. Earlier, the guy did not even know that these people are faced with such specific difficulties due to the characteristics of their types of magic. He finally began to understand the local structure of the world and the magical system. Now the warrior also realized why all these people had such an enthusiastic reaction to his ability. Such a stormy reaction to some seemingly miserable ice even caused the hero a slight pity for them. However, at that moment, a cautious Edmund ran to Mr. A Magical Swordsman. As it turned out, the merchant had a literally perfect commercial offer for the hero with his unique talents. So a few days later, they already settled in the kingdom. The workers were eagerly engaged in landscaping their new store. At the same time, the hero was engaged in freezing water, which was constantly brought to him by workers. With his amazing magic, he could turn several buckets of ordinary water into perfectly even cubes of ice of the highest quality. Everyone only clapped admiringly, admiring the incredible abilities of their dear guest. At that moment, Salt Mudon remembered his reaction when he first heard this commercial offer. Obviously, he was insanely surprised and slightly even angry with such impudence. As it turned out, Edmund wanted to completely restore the business of his trading guild, selling the ice made by the hero. Edmund also explained that the mages of the Fourth Circle can create ice, but usually they are too arrogant because of their status, which is why they get low-quality products. Therefore, he decided to turn to the hero for help. Of course, Sol Mudon understood that there was no malicious intent in the words of the merchant. He simply sincerely wanted to restore the lost reputation of his family. However, the warrior did not want to do this just like that, so he began to actively bargain. Since he produced ice, and Edmund simply sold it, the salt was going to take 70% of all revenue. The merchant himself understood that given the fact that their ice would be sold like hot pies, it was a very good offer for him. However, since there will be nothing for the attempt, he decided to try to bargain further. The man explained that in order to successfully sell ice, he should hire not only a van for transporting goods, but also workers who will pull a heavy van, and magicians who will ensure that the ice does not melt along the way. Therefore, Edmund asked Salt Mudon to make him some concessions, and he agreed to a fair distribution of 60 per 40%. Of course, the merchant was pleasantly surprised that it was so simple to agree. And then, without losing precious time, the young man gave a sheet of paper so that they officially conclude a contract. In fact, Salt Mudon agreed to a deal simply because it seemed to him this will be a great place for a deeper study of the device of this world. However, their affairs went even better than the hero initially expected. At that moment, an excited assistant burst into them, calling his master. He asked him to go to the street for a while to look at what was happening. Obviously, Edmund himself and the Salt of Mudon were intrigued by what had happened. As it turned out, a huge number of potential customers gathered near their institution. All of them came, knowing that the same legendary ice is sold here, so they wanted to get it at least a little. In addition to ordinary buyers, influential merchants also came here ready to make a profitable deal with their trading guild. However, excited Edmund asked people to approach him strictly in turn. But the heated crowd of people did not even try to listen to him, in every possible way shouting each other in attempts to attract attention. At that moment, the hero gave a voice, imperiously ordering people to shut up immediately. This imperative order was heard right in the heads of each present. The warrior himself calmly explained to the townspeople that they should follow the silence and order in their store. If they do not obey the rules again, then they are all ruthlessly thrown out of here. So they need to behave much more carefully and respectfully. Obviously, everyone immediately fell silent and began to carefully listen to the words of this frightening man. Using the moment of lull, Edmund explained to the crowd that, in accordance with their trade policy, they sell the goods only wholesale. If buyers came in order to make a small purchase, they will have to leave with nothing. In the future, they can sell small parties of the goods, but now they do not provide such a service. Small buyers began to be angry. They specially made such a long way and demanded that Edmund do not cross the line and simply sold them the goods. However, the merchant was not going to change his principles of doing business, and the hero immediately began to expel these people from the territory with his stern look. As a result, they had to scatter, indignant that they spent time in vain and failed to get anything. Salt Mudan calmly said goodbye to these unsuccessful buyers, while Edmund warmly greeted all those who met their strict requirements and still stood in line. Immediately, 3 men introduced themselves in turn. A man with a bandage on his head turned out to be a representative of the Mages Trading Guild. An elderly man, Benjamin, was a butler of the Count's family, and a dark-haired, brown-eyed man from an aristocratic family was also present. Edmund was struck by their paper. Mages Trading Guild was part of the top 10 on the entire continent. An authoritative Count family and other noble aristocrats wanted to cooperate with him. Of course, the merchant knew that he could earn a lot in his business, but did not suspect that he would be so lucky with the clientele. And all this was exclusively thanks to the talented magical swordsman. Therefore, Edmund, with sincere warmth, asked the magic swordsman to relax. He could take care of everything else. The hero said goodbye to the merchant, wishing him good luck in the upcoming negotiations. Looking after him, Edmund apologized that he did not tell his savior the true reason why the family business so desperately wanted to revive. The reason was a thirst for revenge for their parents, brothers, and sisters, who died unfairly at the hands of enemies. Therefore, the merchant had to completely restore the family business and use it in order to take revenge on the Duke for destroying their family, using the bribed guild of mercenaries. And while this does not happen, he will stop at anything in his desire. Edmund hoped that Salt Mudan would cooperate with him further, and if his commercial plans are successful, then he will be able to generously repay the hero for help. Lying in bed, Salt Mudan realized that things were going excellently, which means he should begin to actively collect information about the whereabouts of bumps in this world. However, at that moment, Sabina knocked on his room. Salt Mudan was delighted, thinking that it was possible for a pleasant snack. And indeed, just now the girl brought the hero a portion of ice cream. Recently, this delicacy has become his favorite snack, a dish that is prepared by skillful mixing of ice and juicy fruits. He was accidentally invented by Sabina, whom he recently met when he saved. The hero sincerely thanked her for the care, and she only smiled radiantly in response. The warrior immediately began the absorption of this tasty piece. The dish was special, cold, sweet, and juicy to taste. He could not imagine that such an exquisite taste could exist in nature. When Salt Mudan was in the North Sea, he heard that some trading guilds are popular thanks to such ice cream, and now he could perfectly understand them. The hero, twisted in thoughts, unnoticed for himself all his dessert, and this portion was clearly not enough for complete saturation. Of course, he was troublesome to follow the addition of himself, but no one could help him. Everyone was busy with important matters. When the warrior left the room, it was noisy on the street again. Sabina tried to fight off the aggressive attacks of customers who shouted each other loudly, demanding service. However, one of the visitors was only surprised at how impudent the girl was. He arrogantly recalled that similar commoners do not dare to give orders to noble aristocrats. For the hero, these were not aristocrats, but some smug dumbasses. All 3 realized that this girl clearly did not know who they really are. Therefore, they menacingly ordered her not to run into troubles and simply bring them the ice cream that was served here. They heard promising rumors and decided to look to check their truthfulness. So Sabina should be prepared for serious consequences if the ice cream turns out to be tasteless and does not live up to their expectations. Sabina calmly explained to arrogant visitors that, according to the policy of the trading guild, hooligans and rude, ice cream did not serve under any circumstances. Obviously, one of the youths was indignant. How dare some commoner dares to say such things to him, a noble aristocrat? It was extremely unpleasant for them to be in the same room with an ink, and now this girl wanted them to also stand in a common queue with an ordinary people. How did she reach her insolence? However, Sabina patiently explained that the ice cream that she cooked with her own hands is not the product that can be obtained primarily only thanks to aristocratic origin. In fact, the girl could so boldly stand up for herself only because she knew that there was a powerful swordsman nearby, who, if necessary, would come to her aid. Therefore, she calmly explained to the angry aliens that she did not rude to them at all. She simply explained the local rules of trade. However, an angry one of the guys decided that a daring girl clearly wanted to die today. Getting his sparkling blade, he directed his tip directly to the seller's face. However, his comrade hastily asked his friend to restrain himself and not act so recklessly. With such actions, he only humiliated the dignity of their noble family. After that, the leader of the group approached the counter closer and explained in an icy tone that they really want to taste the famous ice cream. Looking at his cold, piercing gaze, Sabina caught his breath. There was a feeling as if the heart itself was frozen with fear. The young man calmly explained that he could not stand waiting, so he demanded that the girl immediately fulfill their order. At the same time, he added with a threatening grin that it was better not to tell them about the need to wait. Sabina pressed and immediately stuttering agreed to fulfill the request. At this tense moment, Edmund himself approached the counter, categorically recalling that they fundamentally do not sell ice cream to hooligans and insolents. The merchant was struck that Sabina completely forgot about this most important rule. The hero intuitively understood for sure between the trading guild and these arrogant guys, something serious happened in the past, since Edmund reacted so rudely and uncompromisingly. At this moment, the owner of the institution imperiously demanded that the uninvited guests immediately leave the territory. In the future, any violations of the established rules of the guild will be absolutely unacceptable. Obviously, the aristocrats were furious from the fact that some miserable merchant dared to insult them in this way. However, Edmund disappointedly recalled that the insolents do not even understand the true reason why he refuses to sell them the goods. It was not only that they arrogantly burst out of turn. Only one of those present was enough courage to ask about the true cause of such hostility. But Edmund, evil, who was grinning, invited the boy to find out the details of the Duke von Icar. One of the guys became extremely interested in how this despicable merchant knows the name of his father, after which the young man began to carefully peer into the facial features of a man. Something familiar and recognizable flashed through them. Soon he distinguished expressive features of the head of the once prosperous trading guild, after which he only began to mock contemptuously, recalling the sad story of the fallen Guild L. This sinister grin immediately recognized his close ones. It was such a smile that appeared every time Justin came into a state of blind rage. Then, slyly grinning, the guy exposed his honed blade. And with cold cruelty he reminded Edmund that the death penalty was entitled to insult the aristocrat. Then, a young man without the slightest warning quickly attacked the head of the trading guild. He only squinted gloomily, understanding bitterly. If he is dead now, he could not even avenge his torn family. And this circumstance angered him more than anything. However, having blocked a mortal blow, a magic swordsman unexpectedly intervened in the battle. Despite all the power of the attack, the enemy failed to even minimally scratch his skin. Justin himself was angry with the fact that some geek dared to intervene in his personal disassembly. He was convinced this guy was also one of the insolents dreaming of an imminent death. The hero only shook his head indignantly. He came here to calmly eat the second portion of his beloved ice cream, but instead he fell into some completely incomprehensible situation. At first they simply told them that they would not sell ice cream to the hooligans, and now these psychopaths have already tried to kill everyone to the right and left. Salt Mudden calmly explained to the spoiled children that they completely lack elementary good manners. He decided to take advantage of the opportunity to teach them a vital lesson of education. Having become even more angry, Justin immediately flew into the Salt of Mudan with a growl, mentally planning that he would die with this arrogant Edmund in the next seconds. However, no matter how much he tried to attack the enemy, the hero each time evaded blows with a mocking grin on his face. But a warrior from another world was also amazed. Despite the young age of the attacker, he had quite good combat power. But here's the bad luck. No matter how much Justin waving his sword, he could never get an evading enemy. As you know, since ancient times it was believed that aristocracy exists in order to create harmony in society. But the aristocrats today have clearly proved that they have no moral principles at all. However, Salt Mudden was not so far from reality by a man, so today he will necessarily bring the manners of these spoiled children in proper order. Justin became even more furious. How this commoner dares so impudently in the presence of a noble aristocrat. However, Salt Mudan was absolutely the same as Babbleting, this smug insolent. Only iron discipline is able to teach such people true respect for others. This situation was very reminiscent of the hero of the realities of the Central Plains. He almost forgot how the world was arranged because of his attachment to his lover, but in the end the truth was that the strongest survived. After that, the warrior attacked the burnt guy with a clot of shapeless energy. She struck his hand like a reel, released from a huge strong arrow. As a result, on the side of the youth, a gaping bloody hole remained. The hero looked at the torment of the stained Justin with a clear, undisguised contempt. However, this was far from the end of the promised punishment. Salt Mudon continued to step slowly at the rest of the opponents. Justin's friends immediately grabbed the swords, ordering him to stop immediately, otherwise they would not be greeted to all. However, they themselves trembled under one piercing, chilling look at the powerful warrior. At that moment, Justin began to rush off his knees. Friends begged him to sit calmly. He needed an urgent rest to restore. But he was in a state of absolute rage and ordered everyone to get out of his path. When, despite the heavy wound, Justin again stood opposite the hero, He realized that the enemy really had a considerable talent for all the combat. But since he decided to continue the battle, then the well-deserved retribution could continue further. The warrior wanted to see how long the stubborn Justin would last against his overwhelming power. However, the hero again without much effort pushed this arrogant guy from himself. Friends were worried, asking a comrade to finally recover. In addition, with horror, they noticed his mutilated wrist, which looked extremely painful. Salt Mudon was openly disappointed. This boastful guy withstood only one of his blow. He turned out to be much weaker than the hero initially expected from a representative of a noble family. The warrior even decided to stop there. In addition, he knew almost nothing about the structure of this world, so he could not so thoughtlessly kill people to the right and left. For this reason, he decided to finish the conflict on a peaceful note, realizing that the confrontation should no longer continue. But Justin finally became furious from the heroic behavior of the hero. He behaved as if he did not know exactly who was in front of him. Therefore, the young man was angry even more, not understanding how someone dares to insult Justin von Icar himself so much. Salt Mudon, looking at his opponent, realized the guy in front of him is an absolutely brainless creature. He is not even able to express the current situation soberly and is simply obsessed with blindness. The hero used to just mercilessly kill such nearby people in a past life without unnecessary ceremonies. But if he now killed him, he would hardly have been different from this moral freak. At this moment, the rest of the guys began to threaten that Salt Mudon would not get away with a mockery of noble nobles. Finally angry with their words, the hero began to look for a suitable improvised tool. It turned out to be a thick stick that was successfully lying near him. When the warrior lifted her, everyone felt a small stream of wind. It turned out Salt Mudon endowed her with the power of his sword. At this moment, the hero covered his stick with the energy of the blade, after which he calmly explained that he wanted to test the true abilities of boastful Justin a little. He only screamed in a panic, demanding that the Salt of Mudon does not take no longer a step in his direction. However, the warrior was too angry to listen to these miserable prayers. He only grinned, looking at their genuine fright. Since the time of his past life, the hero firmly knew, for such lousy insolence, the best medicine is an ordinary club. Therefore, he methodically began to beat their blow behind the blow, inserting his brains into a place. This educational event lasted already until the sunset itself. In the evening, standing on trembling knees, the guys began to humiliately apologize for their defiant behavior. They admitted that they were absolutely wrong, and begged them only to let them go alive. The hero graciously agreed to their request. However, he warned, if they once again come here, or complain to someone about what happened, then they are definitely not to do. Justin perfectly understood. Salt Mudon is very serious. He will kill them all without hesitation, chop off their heads and will stomp in their corpses for a long time. Therefore, the young aristocrat yelled loudly that he was wrong and will never repeat the fatal mistake that he made today. So Salt Mudon was finally convinced. The club is really the best way to educate spoiled youth. From now on, he asked the guys to be much more attentive in relations with other people. At the same time, Edmund looked at their magic swordsman with tears in his eyes and sincere admiration. The merchant understood that this amazing guy committed what he himself was completely unable to do. Somewhere at the same time, events moved to the majestic royal palace. There, near the king, all his devoted subordinates gathered to discuss the last important information. Count Slave reported that today a detailed report was received from the scout, whom he sent to the Kingdom of Serbia a few days ago. King Tomilov III was clearly interested in his words with undisguised curiosity. Then the Count thoroughly explained. The Kingdom of Serbia managed to regain the strategically important region of Black Stone in the north, which was previously considered completely nonsense and useless. In addition, there are persistent rumors that the Kingdom of Hyzen is going to actively master the mysterious territories behind the Sahara Desert. The Duke of Icarus heard that too many dangerous monsters live on the other side of the desert, so that people are safe to live there. It became extremely interesting to him. Does Hyzen take any special measures to protect the settlers? The Count was not completely sure of this, but suspected. Perhaps they want to lure the legendary Inaz to themselves. These guesses caused a real shock in the king and all those present. The rest of the counts sitting at the table reacted in the same way. No one could believe that the Count really speaks of Inaz, one of the 10 greatest masters of the sword on the whole continent. They all heard that this legendary warrior always categorically refused any proposals, despite the fabulous amounts that they offered him. He wandered around the continent and at the same time did not linger anywhere for a long time. Obviously, no one could understand why such an outstanding person suddenly decided to go to Hyzen. Then the Count suggested, perhaps the legendary swordsman ran out of money, and perhaps he had a lover. And the king understood, this is quite likely. Once he heard about a mysterious woman in whom the strongest man of the continent was passionately in love. She was the younger sister of the current King Hazen, Princess Daphrine. Apparently, the ruler of Hazen decided to give his precious younger sister to this man in exchange for his invaluable help. If this is really true, then now there were two masters of the sword in the Hazen kingdom. And now, after all the unsuccessful attempts to expand, they will try to capture the territories fixed back in the time of the first ruler. In the east, the Hazen Desert Nation expands its possessions. In the south, the trading nation Serbia is actively mastering new lands. In addition, the Empire Zev, located behind the sea in the west, also aggressively expands its territory. Therefore, they could not just sit back and watch what was happening. And the king asked the opinion of the courtiers. Which is better to do in the circumstances? The duke believed that it would be nice for them to also expand their own territory in any available ways. The king reasonably remarked there was no suitable place where they could direct the expansion. He guessed that perhaps the duke had in mind the other side of the Lazar Mountains, what was north of their lands, and it seems that they simply had no other reasonable choice if they wanted to survive in this struggle for power. The northern lands are extremely difficult to master and conquer, and even if it is possible to capture them, this part of the continent is almost useless because of the eternal ice covering it. That is why all nations are reluctant to advance north. After all, this means that in the end you are out of the struggle for power over the fertile lands of the continent. Sooner or later, someone will still send to the north to resolve the issue of territorial expansion. The king suggested finishing today's meeting at this moment so that he could think over everything and discuss all the details next time in more detail. The duke bowed respectfully and retired. However, looking at the count, the accompanying king realized these two clearly conceived something secret. Soon the count and the king were left alone in a separate office. The ruler decided to find out from his close did he make any serious mistakes lately. If this did not happen, then it remained a mystery why the duke again performs exclusively selfishly. For the past 10 years, he has been sending everyone who rebelled against him to exile to the north. However, the count believed that everything that was happening was exclusively his fault. Of course, the king did not think so. After all, the count was the only person of all close people to whom the ruler could still unconditionally trust, and Count Cato was very touched by such trust. Seeing the sadness of his faithful comrade, the king decided to transfer the conversation to a lighter topic. The ruler mentioned that in the capital they recently began to serve some special ice cream. It was about the L Trading Guild. Of course, initially the king imagined ordinary ice on a stick. However, this ice cream was called this because it tastes incredibly sweet, unlike all other types of frozen treats. Then the king became interested in how long this mysterious store has been working, and the count said that their story was quite long and confusing. Suddenly, Khotan decided to offer the king, before going to sleep, to look into the trading guild. He believed that the ruler would definitely please the opportunity to enjoy this exquisite dessert, and it seems that it was exactly the proposal that the king secretly expected. He only laughed how well his old friend knows and understands him. However, this was a mandatory quality for a person who helped the king himself in government. Then the ruler decided to find out when exactly they can look into the trading guild behind the portion of the famous ice cream. Somewhere at the same time on the streets of the city, there was a calm night. The hero peacefully enjoyed his well-deserved portion of excellent ice cream. However, unexpectedly, the children approached the peacefully resting hero, timidly asking the magical swordsman to become their mentor. Of course, they perfectly understood. It was extremely impolite to break into him without warning. In addition, the guys knew very well that not everyone was able to comprehend the secrets of magic. However, it was vital for them, because if something dangerous happens to the guild, like the last time, the ability to stand up for himself and loved ones would be saving. Children even solemnly promised to engage in hard, if only the Salt of Mudan undertook to teach them combat skill. Of course, the hero sincerely pleased the noble intentions of these brave children. But he was forced to recall, he is not a wizard at all in the usual sense. Laufey remembered perfectly that it was a special martial art, about which Salt Mudan somehow mentioned earlier. In any case, it was important that the hero did not own the classical magic of this world. More precisely, those techniques that he used most often were called a divine ice shot. But he could not teach children what he himself really did not know. Then the young students wanted to learn precisely martial art. Obviously, this was not at all the reaction that Salt Mudan initially sought from the conversation. However, the children sincerely liked this wonderful idea. It was completely unimportant if it would be magic or martial art. As a result, they all at once began to persistently ask for the hero to teach them. Salt Mudan peered into the honest, sincere eyes of the guys. In them, the unshakable determination was glowing in them to achieve their goals. Looking at them, the warrior seemed to remember his own childhood, how he fled to his father, demanding that he began to teach him martial arts as soon as possible. Of course, it was not very convenient for the hero to take someone's training when he needed to find his dear bubble. However, these children sincerely wanted to protect those who are dear to them. Moreover, it was these guys who helped him, a man who knew absolutely nothing about the structure of this mysterious world. According to internal rules, he could not just teach their martial arts of the North Sea. But it was a completely different world, so there should not have arisen serious problems. However, he decided to think carefully, and therefore asked the guys to come to him tomorrow at the same time. Then he will give them his final answer. Obviously, they all shone with boundless happiness, only thinking about the possibility that the hero will become their mentor. The children immediately began to thank him, promising that they would be endlessly grateful and would not forget his generous act until his death. At that moment, Sol Mudon realized. The children already perceived his words as an unconditional consent, and before he managed to object, they immediately joyfully ran away. Of course, the confused swordsman did not understand how everything turned out so unexpectedly. However, he could perfectly understand them. He himself was the same impatient child, and then his mentor had a very difficult time with him. However, unexpectedly, looking out into the street, the hero heard the ominous sound of clanging iron. This alerted him, and he only sighed heavily. Even after such a busy day, he could not relax calmly. At the same time, a bloody battle unfolded. The same Kaiton Changus fell into a serious trouble with the king. They did not expect such a treacherous attack at all, and did not even know whether they could hold out until reinforcement arrived. No one could have imagined that they would be attacked when they just went out slowly for a portion of famous ice cream. However, at this critical second, they heard a suspicious rustle behind their backs. At that moment, the enemy magician began to attack them with the help of destructive magic of fire. Kato understood that it would be extremely difficult to evade or defend himself from such a powerful attack. As a result, the Count overtook the explosion, which is why a powerful detonation occurred. The king only scared, running up to his faithful comrade. Fortunately, he was relatively in order. At the last moment, he managed to block the attack with his blade. However, the ruler saw that the hand of the ally was seriously damaged. Kaiton only apologized for the forced rudeness to his majesty, but now he did not have time to explain his deplorable state. The Count understood that since enemies have a powerful wizard, then something needs to be done urgently. Previously, he did not notice the magician because of the similarity in clothes with ordinary mercenaries. At this moment, Kaiton ordered his people not to hesitate, regroup, and attack again with a vengeance. The opponents, armed with various guns, went on the offensive, so as not to leave anyone from the royal retinue. They obviously only waited for the right moment to turn their neck to these noble blovens. After these threatening words, the Count immediately rushed into battle with double fury. However, he was completely exhausted, because of which 2 experienced mercenaries managed to sneak up from his back. But even in this state, luring them into a trap, the Count managed to screech with attackers to the smallest pieces with his master's blade. Then he entered the battle with another mercenary, menacingly ordering to admit who exactly ordered them to come here to kill. However, he did not see the point of saying anything, given that these people will still die soon. Kato saw, thanks to skillful magic, the enemies greatly varished their ranks, which is why the opponents significantly exceeded their number. In addition, these guys do not intend to leave the royal retinue alive. If they lose this battle, it will be the final end. But for the sake of the prosperity of the kingdom, they were obliged to protect His Majesty at all costs, even at the cost of their own lives. However, at that moment, one of the opponents again began to prepare for a crushing magical attack. Therefore, the Count ordered the remaining fighters to concentrate and defend the king at the cost of his own life. But the enemy understood that they were very late with the reaction. After all, he has already completely completed the preparation of the deadly spell. However, the magician did not manage to finish his spells to the end. He was frozen by an unknown ice force. All those present immediately held their breath, not understanding who decided to intervene in this mortal duel. They understood this person alone was a truly powerful warrior. The hero at that moment mockingly looked at the opponents of the king. The enemies immediately began to look for the enemy with a look, but the wizard suddenly disappeared from the tree branch, on which he stood a moment ago. The frightened mercenaries immediately began to look anxiously in search of this mysterious enemy. In the next instant, he had already appeared right behind their backs. Salt Mudon reproached these insolents for not allowing him to admire the beautiful moon in peace. Then he asked them to finish this unnecessary bloody performance as soon as possible. After all, he did not want his ice cream to finally melted, At this moment, the opponents understood. This man is really incredibly strong. It was impossible to relax even with him even for a split second, but let him take them by surprise. Yet they greatly exceeded the hero by the number of fighters. In this case, it was necessary to kill the king as soon as possible in order to avoid unforeseen complications. At this moment, one mercenary decided to attack the hero and ordered his comrades to immediately kill the king. However, this turned out to be a completely meaningless venture. Salt Mudon only gracefully grabbed the sword, after which he decided to demonstrate the enemy the latest development of the legendary Ice Palace of the North Sea. And of course, the hero courteously asked the enemy not to hesitate and boldly attack. He was clearly furious with the hero's arrogant behavior and, attacking, warned that from this battle the wizard would definitely not come out alive. However, the Salt of Mudan only amused his pressure. Although the hero was clearly disappointed with such obvious attacks of the enemy, he managed to fight off them, even not at all tired. After that, the warrior also deftly dodged several more tricks that sought to injure him. Soon, when the hero was tired of simply pointlessly dodging, he really entered this fight. The mercenary has never been able to catch the hero on the slightest mistake. Salt Mudon, in turn, easily managed to do this, grabbing a man by the face and literally pressing his head into the hard ground with crushing power. At that moment, the king, along with the count, looked at this mysterious fighter with genuine admiration. True, they were a little concerned, not understanding which side this mysterious person was on. However, the king was intuitively convinced this guy was the real hope of their entire kingdom. At this moment, the rest of the mercenaries understood the terrible truth. Their captain is dead, which means a real master of the sword opposed them. And Salt Mudon was only angry, because if these people had not prevented him, everything would be just fine. In addition, he left his precious ice cream on the windowsill, because of which it probably had already become completely unusable. Obviously, no one understood how seriously this young man spoke about his delicacy. But Salt Mudon decided to demonstrate to them how much he was offended by damage to his ice cream. Therefore, he warned he will count up to 3. After that, he can no longer promise that those who stay here will be alive. Of course, the mercenaries considered it some complete delirium and decided to just kill the guy, attacking him from different sides at the same time. So, they rushed to him in the hope of catching him at least on one blow. When the last account came, they all surrounded the hero from different sides. And at that moment, anticipating the danger, he erected a defense of spiritual energy around him. Salt Mudon calmly warned that these people did not even think to say that his methods were too ruthless. After all, he generously gave them a chance to run away. So, having literally created blocks of ice around his figure, the hero tore all opponents into the smallest pieces. Thus, the warrior completely took revenge on his opponents for spoiled ice cream. After he did, Salt Mudon simply calmly left, returning to his home. The king understood that they need to find this mysterious guy Vital and thank him. Count Cotton said with full confidence that he would definitely cope with the task of his master. Soon joyful news reached Edmund. He learned that their children decided to learn magical art. However, this is not what could be learned independently. Therefore, the merchant understood. Most likely, Mr. Magic Mosk taught them. And he was absolutely right. The assistant who reported this, like most members of trading families, wanted to study the secrets of magic. However, for some reason, the hero chose only 4 children for training. At that moment, the merchant felt some strange, tense atmosphere in the air. He understood that it was probably difficult for Edmund to make some decision about their hero, because he was already busy with urgent work. But in fact, the man understood that in the world there were many people who want to learn magic, but very few could really learn this. These children were incredibly lucky with a mentor. Therefore, Edmund decided to personally check the place where all this magical learning will occur. In fact, the merchant understood that the day when their guild will go on a long journey could come even before they expected. Soon it was time to discuss this delicate topic with the hero. Of course, the guy tried to make an innocent look that he did not understand at all what was at stake. However, Edmund has already reported that he was teaching children of magic, and the hero clearly did not expect that gossip about this would be so quickly dispersed in the district. In fact, Edmund was sincerely grateful, and did not know how to properly thank the hero for this invaluable service. At that moment, an assistant who calmly reported to them also approached them. An important visitor came to their respected guest. The hero did not see this guy for the first time. He literally cried, looking imploringly at the Salt of Mudon. The warrior obviously asked him to leave and not to bother him anymore. However, falling on trembling knees, the young man cried, begging to spare him. The unfortunate clutched the hero, explaining that his master said, if he did not give the Salt of Mudon today, he would be punished. Observing this, Edmund absolutely did not understand what the king himself could need from their mysterious master. The guy himself begged that Saltmudon did not refuse today's invitation to the king, if he was at least a little sorry. As a result, at this moment, Saltmudon promised to think about this. This guy came not the first or even the second day in a row, reaching everyone with his desperate cries. Therefore, the hero asked him to stop crying and calmly return to his king. In addition, although the warrior did not know if there was some key to the unraveling of the story with Bummed, it seemed to him fate itself leads him to his lover. Then he also looked carefully at the necklace that swayed on his neck. At this moment, the hero recalled the events that took place several years ago. Then, talking with the assistant, he recalled, in just 3 years they captured the entire region north of the river, and soon the Central Plains should join them. Therefore, Saltmudon did not understand why to negotiate with cunning masters from sea regions. However, the assistant wisely explained, there are times when it is necessary to show his overwhelming force, and there are times when it is not worth doing this. The assistant himself believed that now the right time to show that the icy palace of the North Sea suppresses its rivals not only with rough force, but also with diplomacy. Of course, even if this does not work, they will have to demonstrate their military power again. Then he promised to take the initiative into his own hands. As a result, the ruler decided to listen to a wise friend and agreed to act according to his diplomatic plan. However, he recalled, if the enemies do not want to cooperate with them, then they will simply attack by force. And so, on the way to these fateful negotiations, Saltmudon met a woman of his fate. It seems that day was the most beautiful in his entire long life. Now, smiling from these expensive memories, Saltmudon decided to continue to think about his precious bride, and not to worry too much because of other things. In addition, he understood that he should carefully develop plans for further actions. However, at that moment he was distracted by zealously meditating children. Looking at them, the hero knew there were many ways of learning. So he needed to calmly consider everything and slowly begin to act. At this time, events moved to the king's palace. A faithful assistant came to him and said that Saltmudon again abandoned the royal invitation. The more the ruler thought about this mysterious guy, the more it seemed to him that he was not at all as simple as it seemed at first glance. The king was just about to sincerely thank the warrior for saving his life on that fatal night. Then the assistant promised to return to the hero tomorrow with an answer. However, the ruler considered this slightly pointless, given how many times they have already received a categorical rejection of the mysterious savior. At that moment there was a knock on the massive doors of the royal chambers. The monarch instantly realized Princess Aishild arrived. The desire to see her beloved daughter made the ruler immediately send her assistant away. At the request of her father, the young heiress crossed the threshold and immediately bowed in a respectful bow to the royal special. However, the girl's inquisitive gaze immediately noticed a strangely gloomy expression on the chamberlain's face, which could not but arouse the curiosity of the princess. Not knowing how to delicately circumvent the sharp corners of the situation, the king decided to tell his daughter the whole truth without embellishment. Aishild could hardly believe what she heard, but when it dawned on her that the attempt was committed for the life of her father, the princess quickly ran to the parent, trying to make sure of his well-being. The ruler calmly assured the alarmed daughter that the danger had passed, and everything ended in the best way. However, the young lady could not understand why that mysterious savior stubbornly rejects the royal invitations. The thoughts of the monarch flowed in the same line. That warrior impressed him, an exceptionally capable and worthy person whom the king wanted to see at court. But the mysterious hero seemed to avoid any attempts at rapprochement, without responding to any of the royal requests. After listening to her father's explanations, the princess was finally convinced. This man really had outstanding qualities and incredible power. At that moment, the daughter decided to share the amazing news with the parent. The ice cream, which has recently been created by the L Guild, has become a real hit throughout the kingdom. The realization that the creator of this magical delicacy is the savior of the king only strengthened the desire of the monarch to get this mysterious magician into his ranks. Even Aishild could not forget the unique feeling that swept it during the first tasting of this amazing dessert. But the mysterious magician, which created such a perfect treat, intrigued the princess much more than a simple culinary masterpiece. At that moment, her attention was attracted by children who joyfully holding in their hands icy sweets. The observation prompted Aishild a brilliant idea. She could independently try to meet this elusive warrior. Meanwhile, Saltmudon continued to patiently teach young wards to the intricacies of martial arts. It was amazing how these babies were rapidly developing. In just 2 weeks they have already learned to radiate their own energy. Perhaps the secret was covered in the features of this place, where the concentration of magical power significantly exceeded the level of Central Plains. Finally, the moment has come to complete the next training. The wise mentor understood that since the children successfully mastered control of their mana, it was time to move on to more complex techniques and techniques. However, at this decisive moment, the royal assistant appeared to him, and this time he did not arrive alone. Next to him was a mysterious young lady. The hero tried to remain calm, trying to find out the goal of such an unexpected visit. At heart, he hoped that once in the morning this annoying envoy did not appear. Then at least one day would pass without royal challenges. Suddenly, the warrior noticed how a soft glow emanates from the mysterious necklace of the stranger. At this exciting moment, the young lady decided to remove the hood from her head, opening the elegant facial features. She courteously greeted the hero, introducing herself as a princess of the kingdom of Drake, Aeshield. Hearing this name, Saltmudden instantly realized he finally found the one he was looking for. They even had some external resemblance, albeit a distant, like an echo of distant memories. Soon they already talked at the walls of the guild. The princess said that she had heard about how exactly Saltmudden saved the life of her father. The hero was clearly confused by such a turn of events and almost did not listen to her, and the princess considered his behavior too rude. Therefore, illuminating the interlocutor with a stretched smile, she reminded of the royal invitation to the palace in gratitude. Aeshield was extremely curious why the mysterious savior constantly rejects his father's proposals. At that moment, the warrior recalled that even the angry expression on his face and the intonation of the voice of this girl surprisingly reminded him of his deceased lover. While the hero indulged in thoughts, the princess got angry with his stubborn silence. As a result, Saltmudden calmly explained that he understood the essence of her requirements. Aeshield asked when he would conveniently arrive at the palace. The princess at first could not even believe that she had consent so swiftly, and then she was seized by a real shock from surprise. Saltmudden calmly explained that he perfectly understands the purpose of her visit. She wanted to invite him to the palace, and in principle he did not see the point of arguing with the will of the king. The warrior asked Aeshield to set an exact date and the time when he should appear in the palace. The princess immediately offered him to arrive tomorrow at about 11 in the morning. And as soon as the hero agreed to this proposal, the girl decided to leave. After her departure, Saltmudden plunged into deep thoughts. Tomorrow, he will go to the palace and will be able to see this girl again. But she was a princess, the daughter of the king, the most influential person in this country. It is unlikely that a simple warrior could count on intimacy with such a high-born special, and even more so on marriage. This time he had to carefully plan everything. After all, he could not repeat those fatal events that forced him to go to another world. Saltmudden realized he needed the help of Edmund. The hero appeared to the wise old man, and directly announced his intention to marry Princess Aeshield. Obviously, the man considered that the young warrior completely lost his mind. Such a reaction could not but anger the hero, but soon he quickly pulled himself together. Only slightly irritated, Saltmudden decided to find out why. According to the old man, he would not succeed. The reason was severe. Princess Aeshield was the only child of the late wife of His Majesty, Queen Swan. She was also the only legitimate heiress of the throne. The hero was a simple warrior without status or position, unknown by a stranger. It would be absurd if he dared to make a proposal to the princess. No one would allow like that. To become the groom of the heiress, he must be a prince or great duke, or at least the offspring of a high-ranking aristocratic family. Such obstacles clearly did not delight the hero. However, he realized, if he had the appropriate status and fame, this would be a powerful help to marry Aeshield. Edmund calmly explained that for a start, the hero needs to earn all these privileges. The warrior immediately determined to immediately go for honors in the shortest possible time. However, the wise mentor stopped the hot young man, asking if he knew how to behave in the palace. As expected, the hero had no idea about etiquette. After that, Edmund put before the guy 6 thick folios. All of them contained the foundations of court etiquette. The old man was ready to teach the warrior everything he needed, because he understood. If you leave everything as it is, and an annoying incident will occur, not only the Mudon salt will suffer the damage. The hero himself could not understand why Edmund was ready to help him and looked so excited. But since it was a foreign country with special traditions, he had to submit to the local rules and trust this training. In the evening of the same day, Saltmudden already carefully listened to Edmund's instructions all night and the next day, at least until the moment when it came to go to the palace. Turning in an exquisite outfit, the hero headed for the castle, where he was already expected. Soon, the royal carriage brought him to the gates of the royal palace, and the courtiers announced the arrival of the magic swordsman. As soon as Saltmudden met with the king, he immediately leaned in a respectful bow, welcoming His Majesty. The monarch met a young warrior with an open embrace, rejoicing that he had finally honored him with his visit. The hero was surprised. Today a meeting was to take place not only with the king. He counted on a private audience, but many noble persons were present in the palace. The princess apologized to Mr. Sol Moudon. She did not intentionally make an appointment on such a crowded day. Looking at her excited face, the guy believed that the girl really did it unintentionally. At that moment there was an indignant voice from the side of the place where the Duke Ikar was sitting. Salt Moudon calmly turned his gaze towards the man whose voice seemed familiar to him. He quickly realized this is the same insolent that he once learned. Therefore, the hero only smiled slyly, which scared the aristocrat a lot. He immediately began to fade it, calling the Salt of Moudon the most indecent words. However, his father ordered his son to shut up. With his behavior, he put himself a fool in front of the king himself. There was no choice, and the aristocrat had to obey. The king, talking with the count, realized. It seems that the rumors that the savior did well with this guy during his walks with friends were not empty. After that, the ruler decided to find out what made Moudon's Salt so suddenly accept the royal invitation. The monarch honestly admitted that he was very upset by constant refusals. Salt Moudon calmly explained that his reason was really good. As the king is known, in the trading guilds the colossal volume of work is currently, and because of the lack of workers, he turned out to be the most busy, since it was he who had to produce ice. That is why the warrior wanted to prepare a sufficient supply in advance, and then go on a visit to the king. However, orders grew every day, and even when he cooked more products, it always ended. So after the day, everything was postponed until finally the free day came. The king only apologized. He never thought about this reason. Now, given that their ice cream is sold like hotcakes, Salt Moudon was to really be incredibly busy. The hero with a grateful smile thanked the ruler for his understanding. In fact, he realized, compared to the father of his bride in a past life, this man was like a real kind fairy. At that moment, the good-natured monarch decided to find out the name of the young savior. However, the hero did not have a name. He was simply called a magic swordsman. The king did not want to turn to his savior so officially that he created certain inconvenience. While the ruler was puzzling over this problem, Sol Moudon thought that it would be better to come up with a name, since it is so exciting the king. Suddenly Aishild made an unexpected offer. In fact, she wanted not only to give the hero a name. The princess proposed to assign the title to the savior. It was this man who managed to save her father's life, so the title would become a worthy reward. The duke only praised the princess for such an excellent decision. It was this warrior who saved the life of the king and was supposed to be rewarded for this. In addition, he believed that the princess's thoughts were worthy of the true future ruler. The king also realized that one could no longer ignore the person who saved his life. Therefore, rising from his seat, he decided to assign the hero the title. At that fateful moment, the ruler remembered that evening when he almost died, and the moment when he saw the Salt Moudon saving his life. One word came to mind. Then he asked the hero to go forward. Salt Moudon thought for a long time about what was happening. He did not really like the prospect of bowing his knees, but so he could marry the princess and was ready to take a chance. Then the king of the kingdom Drake turned to a valiant man who saved his life and his subjects in a critical situation, not sparing his own life. From now on, he gives him the title of Baron with the name of the Vuga. The hero did not immediately understand. In the language of this world, the blizzard meant a snowstorm. This name really suited him. The king himself explained that this title would allow you to convey the name to one of the descendants in the kingdom of Drake. Then he asked Baron to rise from his knees. And, patting the young man on the shoulder, he admitted, if not for him, now the king would not be here. For this, the monarch wanted to thank him. However, Salt Moudon proudly stated that if this happened again, he would have acted just like that night. At this moment, the duke reasoned that for the savior of the king's life there is not enough one title. He considered it fair to provide the baron's estate corresponding to his title. The king understood. For the baron to get the feud for possession was an unprecedented event, and he was worried that many could have questions. However, the duke confidently stated that no one would dare to proceed to the order of the king. If there is such a daredevil, he will personally remind him of the meaning of royal decrees. The ruler began to guess what hidden motives the duke could have for such an act, so he decided to consult with other courtiers. However, when they doubted, the duke immediately looked at them angrily. The frightened nobles immediately stated that they fully support the allocation of the new baron of land. Thinking, the king realized that they did not have a suitable territory that they could give to the Baron Blue. However, the duke immediately corrected his majesty. The ideal land was found. These were the northern wastelands, which he mentioned several meetings ago. It so happened that they needed a lord whom they could send there, and everything turned out by itself. If you think about it, the name of the Baron Blood and the northern lands were perfectly combined. The king finally understood the true plan of the duke from the very beginning. He wanted to force Mudin's Salt to pay for the damage caused to his son and family pride. From the very beginning, such suspicions crept up from the very beginning when the Duke gave a voice. Eskild was also worried. They were going to send Mudin's Salt to the same ice continent, and it seemed somewhat unfair to the girl. The hero perfectly understood the actions of the Duke. He probably did it only because he wanted to expel him from here because of the incident with his son. However, Salt Mudin decided not to refuse such an honorary proposal. On the contrary, the young warrior intended to use this as a brilliant opportunity to strengthen his reputation. Only in this way he could reduce the abyss in the status of each other and the princess. Returning to the trading guild, the hero spoke about the events in all details. Edmund, of course, could not believe that his ward seriously goes to the northern lands, where merciless snowstorms were raging, deadly avalanches go, a fierce cold rain and mana flows are extremely unstable. However, the wise mentor asked the old man not to worry in vain. He certainly would not catch a cold in those parts. And if mana was really unstable, then this only added interest to the upcoming journey. After such words, Edmund seriously thought perhaps their savior, a magic swordsman, was more like a Yeti or was his closest relative. Yeti were considered legendary creatures who from ancient times lived exclusively in the northern parts. Outwardly, they resembled people, but, according to legends, their growth reached approximately 3 meters. Thanks to this growth, these creatures possessed monstrous power, while, according to rumors, they were absolutely immune to both cold and physical impact. However, given that almost no one saw them with their own eyes, there was a considerable chance that all this was only a legend. In addition, among the inhabitants of the kingdom, there were stubborn rumors that one resident of the north was equal to 100 warriors from the rest of the country. That is why the northerners hated when they tried to manage them from the outside. They recognized only their own power. Such information seemed to the hero very intriguing. If he manages to achieve recognition of the inhabitants of the north, his reputation will increase significantly. True, in words it sounded quite simple, but reality could be much more severe. When the warrior was about to go to his room to prepare for departure, his gaze fell into 4 crying children. The kids desperately wanted to go on a trip with the teacher. However, for children who only recently got acquainted with martial arts, the northern lands posed a mortal danger. Children patiently explained that they still have a lot to study, and if the teacher leaves, they will not be able to fully master combat equipment. Therefore, young students literally begged the hero to mercy on them and take with them. Suddenly, at this emotional moment, the hero noticed that Princess Aeshild decided to visit him on a visit. The girl was embarrassed by Baron, and he immediately felt that something unusual was happening with the princess. Obviously, she wanted to talk with a newly made Baron alone, waiting for the children to leave them. Therefore, the hero gently asked the young students to leave them for a while. The kids looked at each other meaningfully, as if deciding something among themselves. Then they warned that they would leave only if Salt Mudin listens to their request to the end. As a result, the warrior had no choice but to give such a promise. As soon as the hero agreed, the children immediately sank away happily, leaving adults alone. Aeshild only smiled at this scene. She did not suspect that Salt Mudin had such energetic students. However, a warrior with a light grin corrected the princess. They are not so much energetic as rebellious. After these words, the girl only laughed, and it seemed that she felt a little easier on her soul. However, the true reason for her visit was serious. The princess came to apologize to the Baron. After all, it was she who asked her father to appropriate the hero, acting without any evil intent. But for this reason, he was now sent to the harsh northern lands. Earlier, Salt Mudin had already noticed the similarity between the princess and the bump, but he did not expect how similar they were. Aeschild in the same way apologized to him because of the actions of her father. Remembering these moments, the warrior could only smile and not be angry with fate. But still, he calmly explained to the girl, if he had not received this title, he would never go north. The princess again apologized for her actions, making it clear that she was sincerely sorry for what happened. However, the hero made it clear that after her apology, nothing would change dramatically. In the end, he still had to go somewhere to strengthen the situation. And then, as he expected, the beauty suggested somehow to console Mr. Baron. Then the hero suggested that he hand him a talisman for luck. However, it seems that the girl did not even imagine what she had in mind by a similar subject. The hero, instead of the traditional talisman, boldly asked him to give him a kiss filled with sincere care for another person. At first, the princess was madly embarrassed by such words, and then she just screamed in fright and surprise. At that moment, the warrior realized that he was too rushing with such a bold offer. In any case, he already needed to go and prepare for the upcoming departure. Therefore, He gently asked Ashiel to forget his last words and not take them seriously. Obviously, the girl was very angry. After Salt Mudon said something like that, he dared to leave so calmly. However, something in his appearance made her heart beat much more often than usual. For some inexplicable reason, she distinguished in him completely different features, unknown to her nations. This made the princess literally hold his breath from excitement. Therefore, she even stopped the hero, asking him to wait a little more. The girl could not understand why the behavior of Mudon's Salt seemed to her so familiar and relatives. As a result, after the survivor vision, she suddenly agreed to reward the hero with a talisman of good luck. Of course, the Salt Mudon was extremely confused. He pronounced this just as a joke and did not expect that the princess would agree to this. Therefore, the warrior tried to dissuade her from such a decisive step. He even insisted that the beauty simply ignore his frivolous words. However, pulling the baron to her, the princess suddenly awarded him a gentle kiss. After which she was very embarrassed by what was happening and immediately hid her flushed face under a deep hood, leaving the hero in complete perplexity. And then she quickly ran away, not looking back. At that very moment, the guy realized he must necessarily achieve brilliant success in the northern lands and return to the princess winner. Soon, the first news came to the distant northern region that a new lord was being sent to them. There were stubborn rumors that he saved the life of the king himself, for which he received not only the honorary title, but also land possessions. In addition, local residents heard incredible stories about how this warrior alone defeated 100 enemies in an instant. However, sane people considered such stories nothing more than an empty fiction. But even with such doubts, it remains strange that the person who saved the king decided to go to these harsh lands. Only one of the conversational northerners understood the true cause of what was happening. This guy clearly fell into the disgrace of the influential Duke of Karus. However, for local residents, such palace intrigues did not matter. They still did not know for sure whether this young lord really possessed the legendary force. Therefore, one of the local men, Max, simply intended to scare the stranger properly, so that he would run away quickly from here. Meanwhile, in the snowy northern lands, 2 hunters tracked wyvern, skillfully hidden from their eyes among ice blocks. At this critical moment, the hunter girl saw something truly terrifying. A real snow dragon sneaked through a dense winter snowstorm. As a result, the powerful predator managed to knock down a girl named Moon. Her friend immediately rushed to her help, cursing fate for falling into such a dangerous situation. But they just wanted to get a couple of precious icons of wyverns. At that moment, the girl herself rubbed her bruised head, trying to recover after the fall. However, then she noticed with horror that behind her friend Jake was already hiding a snow dragon, which had wide opening her deadly mouth. The monster clearly intended to swallow the guy as a whole. But at that moment, a mysterious hero came to the aid of hunters unexpectedly. With only one lightning-fast movement of his blade, he brought his head to such a giant, as if it were an ordinary tree branch. Obviously, after what they saw, people could not recover for a very long time, breathing heavily from the experienced deadly horror. The hero calmly explained to the shocked hunters that now everything would be in order with them. The moon immediately began to warmly thank the unknown master for the enormous help provided to them at such a desperate moment. However, the stranger calmly explained that he had fulfilled only what any worthy lord of these lands should do. After that, the mysterious savior said goodbye to the hunters, promising that they would certainly be seen later under more favorable circumstances. Then he instantly rushed away, moving at such an incredible speed that it seemed as if he had just disappeared, teleporting in an unknown direction. However, at the same moment, an attentive Jake called out his girlfriend. He noticed the eggs of the wyverns, for the sake of which they risked their lives, also mysteriously disappeared. Soon the new lord reached the majestic walls of his palace. When he sat on the throne in the main hall, he found with great surprise that he had only one single servant in front of him. All other subjects did not appear at the ceremony, although they knew very well that today the solemn inauguration of the new ruler would take place. The faithful knight apologized to the lord and offered to again send messengers to every village with a repeated invitation. However, the baron understood even if he would send someone, it is unlikely that local residents deign to come to the palace. Of course, Salt Mudon was very disappointed that these people are so dismissive of their duties to the new lord. Gradually, he began to understand why all the previous rulers here were so rapidly replaced by one after another. However, the hero had his own very effective approach to such rebellious subjects. A few days after the commemorative inauguration, the same man who proposed organizing a strike against the new lord visited his comrades in the local bar. What was his surprise when he saw that they were greatly beaten? Smutyan could not understand who did it with his associates. Perhaps the culprit was the same new lord, and this guess was absolutely true. The victims were extremely upset by the way the ruler was brutally treated, but at the same time they were forced to recognize his outstanding combat skill. They said that the lord moved so quickly and deftly that no matter how they attacked, they could not even move when he touched their bodies with their own hands. In addition, his blows were so accurate and painful that the pain caused was literally indescribable. But at this tense moment, another city dweller quickly burst into the bar. He loudly announced to the audience that the lord was now in the central city square, and clearly intends to turn to the people. Of course, the squamous man decided to immediately go to him and look at this spectacle with his own eyes. And all local residents were amazed that the greatest warrior of the Kareloi finally decided to take some active actions. People believed in the legendary fighter and hoped that he could show this stranger his true place. Meanwhile, standing on a spacious square, the hero looked around with interest the assembled crowd. How many people here turned out to be here? At that moment, among the spectators, the moon was unexpectedly saw the very man who saved her from faithful death in ice wastelands. However, at that moment, her father approached the girl. The man was perplexed that she had forgotten here among the curious crowd. The daughter explained that she came precisely because she saw many gathered people who had to greet the new lord. Finally, the moon realized who the mysterious person in reality was saving her, and what exactly he had in mind when he spoke of his duty. The girl excitedly told her father about how one noble man saved her life when she was in mortal danger, trying to get eggs of an ice wyvern. Obviously, it was extremely difficult for Max to accept the fact that the person who saved his beloved daughter was the same new lord. Everything became much more complicated than he initially expected. Moreover, an unknown warrior did not defeat the usual wyvern, but a rare ice variety. Such a feat was considered difficult even for an experienced fighter of the level of the Kari of the Moon. Being an honest warrior, Max was supposed to admit the outstanding talent of this man. But now they could no longer retreat from the planned plan. Therefore, the legendary fighter extended his hand to greeting and introduced himself as a new lord as Max, the greatest warrior of these harsh lands. The hero calmly explained that he was recently appointed ruler of Kareluna under the name Baron Vuga. Various rumors about this mysterious man already reached Max. They said that he walked around the city outside the city, ruthlessly beating rebellious people. However, Saltmudon simply and honestly explained that he only strictly punished those who tried to openly rebel against his legal authorities. The warrior sincerely hoped that Max was not going to be among such troublemakers. But as it turned out, the local fighter had a special offer for the new ruler. As well known, in this harsh place it is incredibly cold almost all year round. Therefore, since ancient times, local residents use strong alcoholic drinks. For this reason, Max invited the hero to compete with him in the art of drinking. Saltmudon without hesitation accepted this proposal, which surprised a lot of an experienced northerner. Max even warned the stranger that this is an extremely strong drink that would instantly disperse the blood throughout the body and can dump the unprepared person. However, the Baron of the Vuga calmly accepted this peculiar challenge, ready to prove his resistance in the face of all the trials. But he explained the conditions of the duel. In the event of his victory, Max recognizes him as his master and will follow him unconditionally. Those present were staggered from what they heard, instantly realizing that the bet with Max himself bordered on a drink on real recklessness. Of course, a pampered aristocrat, not accustomed to such northern entertainments, is unlikely to be able to drink more than one sip. Max was well aware of this circumstance, which is why he agreed with such confidence to such a risky deal. Thus, very soon the opponents met at a massive wooden table, and the local warrior sincerely hoped that the newly made lord would keep his solemn promise. At this tense moment, Max himself generously invited the aristocrat to surrender, while it was not too late for a prudent retreat. However, the Baron was a true lord, and could not help but restrain this word, so he asked without unnecessary ceremonies to start a competition. Such self-confidence of the new ruler only angered the experienced Max. The harsh northerner only asked the arrogant aristocrat not to regret subsequently that he had not run away before when there was still such an opportunity. Very soon, the legendary Max no longer felt his own arms and legs at all, and his consciousness began to become dangerous from an unusual amount of alcohol. Of course, his faithful friends desperately tried to bring a mighty warrior to their feelings in all available ways. However, at this critical moment, the famous fighter lost consciousness right at the table. Of course, Max was incredibly difficult to accept the fact that he, the best drunkard in the entire northern region, shamefully lost consciousness during a competition in a drink. Nevertheless, the proud warrior categorically refused to stop the duel, because he could not be so sorry to lose in the face of the whole honest people. He asked to pour him another portion, and the Baron of the Blizzard only laughed condescendingly, asking the man not to be too zealous in attempts. However, even looking at the unperturbed hero, the drunk Max saw that in front of him were two blurry silhouettes at once. The northerner himself could not understand why everything was in order with the new lord, as if he drank ordinary spring water. While the Baron Vuga generously offered a stubborn man to simply give up and preserve the remnants of dignity, he persistently demanded the continuation. Of course, when the local warrior so stubbornly insisted on continuing the competition, Syl did not argue the salt and allowed him to bring the matter to a logical conclusion. As a result, a desperate man in one gulp dragged another bowl of strongest alcohol. The hero drank this fiery drink as if it was the most ordinary spring water. Despite the fact that Salt Mudon did not drink alcohol for a long time, now everything went just perfect for the new ruler. Soon, the warrior heard a loud deaf knock and, turning around, made sure that this sharp sound was a signal of his brilliant victory over the legendary local fighter. Even the faithful friends of the defeated Max could not believe that their invincible comrade was so rapidly disconnected from an excessive amount of alcohol. Then Salt Mudon solemnly turned to all the present citizens and imperiously ordered them to gather in his castle exactly 5 days later. Thus, the new lord intended to check which of the subjects really keep his promises and who is an empty chatterbox. The appointed 5 days flew quickly, and the action again moved to the majestic castle of the ruler. Saying on his throne in the main hall, the Baron saw an impressive company of local residents in front of him. Of course, he did not think at all that they would really appear to fulfill these promises after such a humiliating defeat of their idol. However, the Northerners knew how to fulfill their oaths, which was granted for their harsh nature. However, Salt Mudon immediately interrupted the excuses that all present perfectly understood who he was and what he was capable of. Therefore, the new lord wanted to immediately move on to a serious matter and gave the audience exactly 10 days to prepare for a large-scale move. Hearing such an unexpected statement, the townspeople only opened their mouths from extreme surprise, but nothing intelligible, and did not answer the words of the ruler. The moon did not understand at all what the mysterious hero actually achieved. Did he really want all of them to live directly in his castle? Salt Mudon only patiently explained to the puzzled people that all the inhabitants would simply not fit in his possessions, no matter how spacious they may be. However, he really advised them to collect suitcases and prepare for the road. The thing is that the wise ruler intended to transfer all his people straight to the far north, to safer and more favorable places. Over the past 5 days, Salt Mudon tirelessly wandered around the snowy surroundings and finally found an excellent place in the north, where at least 10,000 people could live with comfort. From now on, instead of existing disparate throughout the territory, all subjects will live together as a single cohesive people. Obviously, the worried Max immediately reminded the new lord that in that distant place, ice cannibals traditionally lived in large groups. It seems that it was about those tall guys with a bear physique who were famous for their extraordinary ferocity. However, Salt Mudon calmly reassured excited people, explaining that he had already met with similar monstrous monsters in the past. Moreover, when the valiant warrior discovered them, he mercilessly destroyed everyone to one, completely freeing the territory from any threats. Obviously, all those present immediately gasped with amazement, as if not believing the fabulous statement of his new ruler in this. Salt Mudon, it seems, did not even understand the reason for their so rapid surprise with such news. In any case, the wise lord asked the subjects not to worry in vain, because he already carefully prepared everything for their arrival, and really found a great place for a comfortable residence. Finally, when he finished his fiery speech, there were still a couple of people who were in no hurry to leave with the main crowd. However, to the considerable surprise of the Baron, among them were Jake and the Moon. These two could not have imagined the last time when the mysterious hero saved them from his faithful death because of his strong confusion from the shock experienced. Salt Mudon, it seemed, was quite clear why they came to him. In any case, he was going to call them to himself for an important conversation. However, looking at their frightened and excited faces, he softly asked young people not to be nervous for no reason, because nothing particularly important or dangerous was foreseen. Instead of long explanations, the Lord asked the embarrassed citizens to follow him. They came to one of the high towers of his majestic palace. There, Salt Mudon proudly showed them 3 charming cubs of ice wyvern, hatching from the very eggs that he once stole during the salvation of hunters. The Moon was convinced that it was the mysterious Salt that Mudon stole these precious eggs, and she was extremely angry with a similar act. Given with what incredible labor they risked their lives, obtaining these treasures, such theft seemed especially painful. However, the hero with an impudent smile reminded the indignant people about who exactly saved them on that fatal day from his faithful death. In any case, this circumstance was not of fundamental importance. He only asked the guests to stay quieter, because the kids were still sleeping peacefully in their cozy nests. At first, a noble warrior thought to grow these amazing kids on his own. However, they turned out to be incredibly noisy and gluttonous creatures, and because of constant care for them, the hero recently just went crazy with fatigue. Only when the wise moon explained that the wyverns hatching from the egg in the first they will see, they would instinctively recognize their adoptive mother, the warrior finally realized why they behaved in relation to him. Therefore, now he seriously did not know whether to continue to grow these annoying and constantly disturbing creatures. The moon patiently explained to the bewildered lord that ice wyverns were much larger and more powerful than their usual relatives, and the hero had a truly great opportunity to tame these rare creatures for his own needs. If the hunters were in his place, they would certainly tame such wyvern. After all, they could be easy to fly to Tenston. It was the second capital of the kingdom, located 1,000 kilometers west of their city. Tente was a place where literally nothing special happened. In addition, on fast wyverns, the road there and back would take only an hour or 1.5 at the most. Of course, such a rapid way of moving could not but interest a practical warrior. Therefore, the Baron decided to learn in detail from these experienced people how best he was to tame these amazing creatures. As it turned out, an entrepreneurial lord had a truly brilliant idea regarding these little winged friends. A few days after this fateful conversation, the people of Caroluna began the great relocation by the solemn decree of their new lord. Near the hero, heading the column of immigrants, his faithful student was walking. It turned out that ordinary people were incredibly not easy in this grueling journey through snowy expanses. Obviously, this circumstance did not surprise at all, given that they had already spent 3 days and 3 nights in a continuous path along a harsh area. In addition, the penetrating warrior noticed among immigrants a lot of people who still did not trust him and continued to hesitate in the correctness of the decision. But very soon they will reach the cherished goal, and then their doubting hearts will radically change for the better. For this reason, soon the Lord invitingly and loudly called all the exhausted travelers. He solemnly announced to the audience that they were almost a long-awaited goal. Even if it's difficult for them now, everyone should hold out very little. Of course, some skeptical people were perplexed. They did not even really know exactly where they were going through this snowy desert. Moreover, the immigrants were not fully confident that there really was not a single icy cannibal left in that mysterious place. However, such an open distrust only angered the impatient lord more strongly. He reminded Doubt that he had already declared victory over all possible enemies in that area. In addition, the wise ruler reminded these people that they were all brave warriors of the legendary Carol, who should not behave so fearfully. After this appeal, the Baron resolutely turned around and followed, confidently leading his people along. It was clearly visible that Sabina doubted a little, that such words would really help to raise the fighting spirit. However, the wise mentor knew. Now people will finally understand him and appreciate him. In addition, all immigrants are aware of the complete truthfulness of his words as soon as they safely reach the destination. Soon the exhausted column reached the entrance to the huge cave, hidden among ice rocks. The students could not believe their own eyes. It really was the very legendary place that their teacher spoke about with such confidence. The warrior calmly explained the amazed ward that he took a lot of time to find this unique cave among the vast northern expanses. In addition, all other immigrants also felt much better and more confident. They could not even imagine that in a harsh Carriol there was something so suitable for a comfortable residence. Here there was even pleasant warm water from the bowels of the earth, which was a real miracle in these parts. At this solemn moment, the Lord also loudly called all the gathered people to his place. He reminded the immigrants that once this mysterious place served as a reliable refuge for fierce ice cannibals. But now they rightly occupied this liberated territory for their own needs. Since the whole people were going to live constantly here, it would be reasonable to give this historical place a new name corresponding to the changed circumstances. He used to live in the majestic northern ice palace, so he decided to choose a name that's similar to this noble name. As a result, the ruler failed to come up with anything better than calling their house a White Castle. However, it seems that ordinary townspeople sincerely liked a similar solemn name for their new house. Now everything that was a prudent hero remained was to transport here the cubs of ice wyvern, for which there was plenty of free space. But at that moment, the warrior suddenly felt some loud piercing sound cutting frosty air. At that very moment, all the immigrants screamed with horror, seeing a dazzling ball of lightning, which suddenly arose right in front of them. From this mystical lightning, slightly crippled little wyverns appeared immediately, which someone clearly transported a magical way. An unknown wizard, obviously, did not understand at all why magic transferred precisely these creatures to such a distant place. and Saltmuden certainly did not expect to meet in such a deaf place an outsider, especially engaged in dubious experiments with his pets. Therefore, an angry lord immediately attacked this impudent guy, ready to deal with him with his bare hands for such audacity. After that, the angry warrior pressed several key acupuncture points of the stranger, instantly forcing his body to completely be numb. And then the mighty baron grabbed the magician by the neck by force and threw it on the frozen earth with a grand scale. The formidable lord made it clear that he does not like to ask questions twice, and does not intend to ask questions. Therefore, he imperiously forced a frightened man to immediately introduce himself, who he was and where he came from. And, obviously, the most important question: how dare he attack the new ruler? At that moment, the frightened magician realized that his paralyzed body does not move at all and does not obey the will. Saltmuden calmly explained to the frightened prisoner that his mouth was not paralyzed and he could well speak. Therefore, it would definitely be better for him to answer all the questions asked as quickly as possible. Then the trembling guy hastily introduced himself to Count Geron von Karawan, hoping that a noble origin would somehow protect him from an angry warrior. Saltmuden did not expect to see here, in this wilderness, a real high-ranking nobleman. In addition, given that he himself was just a baron, it means that this Geron formally stood above his aristocratic hierarchy. Only at this moment the Count himself suddenly realized that in front of him was the very legendary Baron of the Viuga, who saved his life to his majesty, and received the title with extensive land possessions for this. Saltmuden, of course, was very surprised by the fact that this accidental guy knew at least something about him. However, then the penetrating warrior decided to find out whether it was the most former lord, who was appointed rule here, and then shamefully expelled to his inaction. Looking at the magic gun in the hands of a stranger, the Baron suggested that most likely his guess was absolutely true. The former lord himself hastily began to make excuses, claiming that he had good circumstances to urgently escape. However, the Salt of Mudan did not care about such miserable excuses at all. Frightened Jaren hastily recalled that now that the warrior knows his true personality, they could well be on one side. Only in the formidable expression on his face, the former Count of Mudan realized that he was clearly mistaken in his calculations. The angry hero grabbed his head tightly and only coldly explained to the trembling Geron that he could only compare in utility with an ordinary courtyard dog. The cowardly aristocrat did not fulfill his duties to the people and the king. He had to abandon the title and not shamefully escape at the very first difficulties, throwing people to the mercy of fate. But this time, the harsh baron decided to give him particular mercy, but ordered that the miserable coward would not even think to neglectfully look at him next time. After that, the powerful warrior removed the ice needles of acupuncture from the captive's body, and now the paralyzed body has become free, allowing the Count to move calmly. First of all, the liberated guy immediately collapsed to his knees, desperately trying to catch his breath after the nightmare experienced, and the formidable Baron was the last time warned a cowardly aristocrat. If Jaren says at least one stupidity, he will die here in the place at the same second. Only when the frightened Count solemnly swore that this would never happen, the Baron Blizzard finally calmed down and changed his anger to mercy. Therefore, he pointed to his wounded wyvern, imperiously ordering the guy to immediately cure them all to one, which was not a little surprised by the Count. Saltmuden explained that he was too confident in his abilities to understand people and their potential. Since this cowardly aristocrat has just applied quite complex magic, it means that it may well be useful for the needs of the new ruler. After that, the practical Saltmuden calmly left, leaving this responsible case on the conscience of the former Count. Only at that moment did the unlucky guy finally realize that he clearly had something seriously went wrong as it was planned initially. Soon the prosperous settlement has already equipped with cozy tents and temporary dwellings among the majestic ice walls of the cave. During this period, the Baron Vuga came to Count Geron with a very important request, so that he immediately went to the royal capital. There was nothing particularly surprising in such an assignment, since the wise ruler simply wanted an experienced count to deliver a secret letter directly to the king. Saltmuden intended to send an official message with a persistent request for exemption from taxes, because this harsh place was now too much occupied by desperate attempts to earn a living in extremely unfavorable conditions. However, the insightful count understood very well that influential nobles from the central regions would be categorically against such a solution. From their selfish point of view, this seemed a flagrant injustice. If this revolutionary bill is adopted by the king, will they threaten his majesty with non-payment of his own taxes? After all, many of them could say that the conditions in their possessions are no better than the harsh northern lands. Regardless of how mercifully his majesty favored the legendary hero, The monarch will surely abandon such a bold proposal for political reasons. However, the wise warrior explained that the main problem was not so much in ordinary nobles, as in one specific person. In the center of all intrigues, it was the Duke, who initially sent the Baron to these gods of forgotten places. As a result, Saltmudon still decided not to act so thoughtlessly. Instead, he proposed a special plan of action, after which he leaned over and whispered something to the Count directly on his ear. Giron, it seems, did not believe that this was generally possible to put into practice. However, observing the unshakable confidence of his master, the former Count decided to completely trust his brilliant plan. For this reason, before his responsible departure, Salt gave the faithful assistant a strict order to begin immediate training of local soldiers for a large-scale operation. The fighters were extremely curious why their new leader so unexpectedly gathered everyone in the main hall of the cave. However, at this solemn moment, Saltmudon loudly called all the inhabitants to him, and when his inviting gaze fell on the audience, the faithful Moon responded first. The girl, of course, appeared fully armed, but did not understand at all why the Lord convened such an emergency meeting. However, Saltmudon was completely not against everything to explain in detail the assembled subjects. The ruler calmly made it clear that they would all go to the grandiose hunt for ice wyverns, and their precious eggs will become the true goal. Of course, experienced residents perfectly understood that it was not easy to fight such monsters, especially when the goal was not adults, but their defenseless cubs. But in order to reassure excited people and guarantee their safety, the wise Saltmudon proposed to divide into effective teams of 30 people each. All detachments had to focus exclusively on the skillful theft of eggs. It would be enough to get at least one precious egg from each group. If hunters successfully fulfill their dangerous mission, then they will certainly receive a generous monetary reward. And the team, which will be able to bring the most valuable eggs, will be additionally awarded a truly fabulous sum of 100 gold coins. Of course, it was a huge amount of money that ordinary workers would never have earned by ordinary labor for a whole year. It was extremely difficult to believe that the new lord was ready to give them such an incredible reward just for the wyverny eggs. Even an experienced Max doubted in reality such a fabulous bunch of money promised by a generous ruler. However, Saltmudon never in his life made empty promises. He simply sincerely hoped that the courageous residents would cope with this difficult task. And the hunters were immediately inspired, having become actively preparing for the upcoming hunt with unprecedented enthusiasm. Watching how joyfully they tune in a dangerous business, Saltmudon turned to his faithful assistant with secret instructions. Over the next 10 days, the Count will secretly monitor each team, looking for the most useful and talented guys among hunters. And later, the wise lord planned to use the most capable fighters for completely different, more important purposes. Obviously, the insightful Giron immediately thought that their new lord was seriously thinking about creating his own knightly order. And, it seems, the former Count was practically right in his guesses. Saltmudon was pleasantly surprised by the striking resourcefulness of this smart guy. Despite the fact that he entrusted him with responsible work immediately after arriving in the settlement, Giron coped with his duties quite successfully, and immediately realized everything that the wise Saltmudon carefully hinted. As a result, the ruler decided to be with an intelligent assistant, extremely frank. Each worthy lord must have at least one personal knightly order to protect possessions. They said that the knights from the Duchy of Icarus were especially powerful and skilled warriors. These fighters were so superior to ordinary soldiers that they would not even lose to the famous royal knights in an honest battle. At this moment, the experienced Max carefully checked the equipment of his faithful fighters. Watching their decisive faces, Saltmudon understood with confidence. Sooner or later, it was these people who would take the status of the best warriors in the kingdom. This time, he will create an army much more and more powerful than the legendary squads of Snow Ice from a past life. After all, the valiant hero could not afford to lose his lover for the second time because of his own weakness. Then he loudly and solemnly declared his devoted soldiers to go to the tasks entrusted to him. Soon, hunting detachments discovered one of the majestic ice wyverns among snowy cliffs. The wise hero watched everything that was happening from afar, patiently expecting how one of the teams would cope with this dangerous test. At this critical moment, a group of hunters was divided into specialized detachments, a team responsible for a direct attack and a group of distraction. A well-aimed Moon skillfully led a aimed shelling from the bow, while the clever Jake managed to skillfully chop off the powerful tail of an angry wyvern. An experienced Max at this decisive moment went straight to the monster's face to finally confuse him with spells. In the meantime, the commander ordered the second detachment to immediately deploy a pre-prepared hunting network. After coordinated actions, they managed to lure the mighty wyvern into a skillfully made trap. It was a fairly impressive result for the first joint hunt, and Count Geron delightfully remarked that people hunted in a similar coordinated way for several tense days. Of course, now their arms and legs worked in perfect synchronism, like a debugged combat mechanism. In fact, the insightful Geron understood that it would never have occurred to him to steal the eggs of the ice wyverna and tame these creatures from infancy. But if everything goes according to the Lord's ingenious plan, residents will be able to earn tremendous money, transporting and selling hunting prey, such as exotic leather and rare bones, to remote cities with the help of tinned icy winger. At this triumphant moment, the warrior loudly praised the second detachment, and also recalled that if they bring from the hunt a lot of precious ices, they will be able to get a truly excellent material reward. And all the fighters only lit up even more by an insurmountable desire this time brilliantly succeed. Thus, Count Geron was finally convinced. The new lord managed to unite the uncontrollable single warriors into a single cohesive whole. And it doesn't matter how many times he watched the like, all the same it remained a truly amazing sight. In this tense second, one of the ferocious wyvern managed to finally kill a skilled fighter named Storm. He turned out to be a rather strong and skillful warrior, and the Baron became extremely interested in who this mysterious guy who fought the ice wyvern with his usual sword. Especially considering that the fighter had such a speaking nickname. He was probably quite famous in certain circles. It turned out that the Storm was a real hero of ordinary people, who regularly raised impudent raids on the houses of evil nobles and generously handed out looted wealth to the needy poor. This noble guy fell into a trap of corrupt guards and was imprisoned in a gloomy prison, but it seems to be successfully fled, hiding here in these wild lands. In addition, watching how naturally he gets along with the locals, it was obvious. The Storm was a very decent person. The Baron even became curious whether there was someone else besides the Storm, who escaped from the royal prisons and found refuge in the northern lands. Therefore, he asked the Count to prepare a detailed report about these people with a criminal past. Perhaps among such fugitives they will be able to find someone really interesting and useful for future plans. Soon, all hunting participants gathered in their spacious cave, which during this time they managed to significantly improve and make more comfortable. The Baron sincerely praised all the participants in the winger hunting for zealous and well-coordinated work. They managed to collect enough precious eggs of ice creatures. The generous ruler promised to give hunters a well-deserved award, as he had previously promised before the whole people. Then the experienced Max raised his hand in order to ask an important question to the new lord. As was said, they really brought eggs of an ice wyvern, but did not understand at all why they were required by the wise ruler. Salt Mudon knew that everyone would be extremely curious for everyone why he suddenly asked to collect these eggs, and decided to explain his ingenious plan in detail. Ice wyverns, hatching from eggs, the first who was seen in front of them, instinctively mistakes for their native mothers, and the wise warrior wanted to tame them with just such a natural method. The Baron planned to use tamed wyvern as a quick and effective means of transporting by air. These powerful creatures will be able to deliver their valuable goods to each country of the continent, opening unprecedented trade opportunities. Then the practical Max posed a reasonable question. What exactly will they specialize in their trading activities? In principle, the inhabitants of the northern lands had many valuable resources, but the first place in the list of Mudon's salt was occupied by rare skin. For example, the unique icy skin of wyverns and other northern creatures. However, ordinary residents at first scaredly considered that Salt Mudon plans to reduce them all into the grave with dangerous enterprises. But they still really wanted to calmly live in their new house. However, the irritated ruler immediately ordered the Penitents to shut up and not to spread unreasonable fears. He reminded the assembled that it was he who got rid of all the ice ogres, which for so long teeming around the territory of their current White Castle. And now he was extremely angry that people really think that he would allow his faithful subjects to become easy food for wild monsters. Locals gradually realized the situation could really radically differ from the previous one. If they act together with the legendary hero, they will certainly be able to achieve unprecedented success and prosperity. As a result, finally inspired by the prospects, everyone decided to unconditionally follow their wise master. However, at this decisive second, a small student of Leo quickly ran up to him with an expression of extreme panic on his face. There was a serious trouble that concerned his eldest student, Sabina's Savage. The boy came running with terrible news. The girl was slowly dying of an unknown illness. At this critical moment, only the faithful Luffy and Anna remained with the dying Sabina, and the girl, barely breathing, tried to calm the crying children with weak forces. The kids only sobbed, begging their beloved sister to hold out a little more, because their teacher will soon come to the rescue. At that moment, An worried hero finally appeared, who decided to personally find out what exactly happened to his student. The state of poor Sabina turned out to be much more serious than he initially expected when he saw her pale face. The alarmed mentor wanted to immediately find out why the girl suddenly became so catastrophically bad, and decided to carefully listen to excited students. As it turned out, helping Mr. Osborne find a suitable place to build a corral for wyvern cubs, they accidentally discovered a huge flower field. This amazing place was full of rare ice flowers that children saw only in old books and never in real life. The admiring Sabina certainly wanted to show these wonderful finds to her teacher, and tore off several of them. Then, along with aromatic flowers, everyone joyfully returned to the camp, anticipating a meeting with a mentor. However, at that moment, the poor girl suddenly lost consciousness, falling on the frozen earth without signs of life. Now all the children were very worried, and the little Leo honestly admitted that he did not know what to do in a similar situation. If your beloved sister does not wake up from this terrible ailment, they simply will not be able to survive such a loss. At this moment, the wise warrior asked the boy to calm down and pull himself together. Then the hero decided to carefully look at the mysterious flower, which the girl was still tightly squeezed in her pale hand. However, this unusual flower Salt Mudan knew very well from a past life. It was called a snowflower, and part time was the only plant that could serve as a healing elixir both in the North Sea and the Central Plains. Obviously, an experienced warrior was extremely interested in how these rare plants could be in a completely different world. But now such issues were not a priority to save the student. An worried mentor asked Leo carefully pick up his sister in his arms and carefully follow him. Soon, a caring boy carefully laid his sick sister on a prepared platform. The unfortunate girl still could not come to her senses after contact with a poisonous plant. She was in delirium between life and death. The concentrated hero asked that excited children immediately move away, because from that moment he began his complex treatment. Kids were strictly forbidden to enter this improvised medical chamber until the wise mentor would give much permission. The children, only crying from hopelessness, obediently left, begging their beloved teacher at any cost to save their expensive sister from faithful death. At this moment, the concentrated hero carefully examined the dangerous snowy flower. In this world it was called an ice flower, and it seems that here it was known as a useless plant that emits only harmful cold air. But in the North Sea, where Mudan's salt once lived, the fruits of this unique flower were an unsurpassed healing elixir. Of course, due to the excessive cold emanating from this plant, it was extremely difficult to collect his precious fruits to an ordinary person. But for the one who perfectly owned ice energy, this represented a completely different, completely solved problem. The poor Sabina fainted precisely because her internal energy was not strong enough to effectively resist the destructive cold of the flower. Therefore, putting healing seeds in her mouth, an experienced hero carefully tried to cleanse her poisoned body of negative effects. Soon, the exhausted girl really began to slowly recover, returning from the border state. However, her weakened body was still motionless. All the treatment took place exclusively in her mind. The teacher mentally warned the student. When she will finally wake up, he will have to immediately sit straight and try to direct his restored energy. It is in this way, when Sabina finally woke up, she immediately entered a state of deep meditative trance. Thanks to this, the destructive cold energy in her body was perfectly transformed into internal healing force. And very soon a lightweight girl finally came to her senses, completely getting rid of mortal danger. However, after the treatment was completed, Sabine staggered greatly and again fell to the ground from sudden weakness. After that, the girl lost consciousness, not even having time to close her eyes from overwork. Salt Mudan, carefully observing the state of the student, understood that its internal energy increased significantly compared to the level that was before. The healing effect of these amazing colors seemed even better than he initially expected. If such results continue, then it would be very reasonable to increase the intensity of its training to consolidate the achieved progress. Of course, before that, when Sabina will finally wake up and recover, everyone will need to make an expedition to that magical field of flowers. Perhaps, thanks to these rare plants, the wise hero will be able to achieve his long-term goals much earlier than the planned time. Very soon, the exhausted girl woke up safely after a long restoration rest. After the successful gathering of precious icy veneles in a white castle, a large-scale reorganization of the entire settlement began. First, the prudent Salt Mudan carefully checked the detailed list compiled by Count Giron, and he formed his own elite knightly detachment. The new combat unit received a proud name, the Knights of Buren. The wise hero decided not to rant a lot, but simply declared the selected fighters with his personal knights. The valiant Storm showed the best results in all aspects of military affairs, so he was appointed captain of the prestigious detachment. Then, with the help of the tireless Salt of Mudon, schools, hospitals, restaurants, bars, and clothing stores were built in the settlement. The practical ruler also placed people in appropriate positions in strict accordance with their natural talents and abilities. The far-sighted lord perfectly understood that since they had to carry out such a cardinal reorganization, it was necessary to attract the appropriate qualified employees to key positions. The reliable Osborne was appointed to a leading position in the safety service of the White Castle. And the capable Jerome, who established himself as a very talented person, became the personal assistant of Mr. Baron himself. Salt Mudon understood. Osborne will show itself much better in the future in the security service than in the role of an ordinary assistant. Of course, the Count was somewhat surprised by his new purpose, given that his original mission was to teach other magical arts. But in the end, having met with the questioning gaze of the hero, Jerome could not refuse such an honorary proposal. Although deep down, he believed that for such hard work, at least 1,000,000 gold coins as fair compensation should receive at least 1,000,000. In addition to administrative reforms, 2 specialized armed groups were created, at least for the first time the formation of a new order. The Guard Detachment will be responsible for protecting the external perimeter of the White Castle, as well as regularly conduct reconnaissance work throughout the region of the Korea of the Moon, and return vagrant residents to the bosom of civilization. Experienced Max became the captain of the Guard Detachment thanks to his combat experience. Another elite group is the Knights of Wyverns specializing in air operations. However, regarding the air unit, Salt Mudon still experienced certain doubts. Since there was no wyvern adult and strong so that an adult can ride them on horseback and make flights, they were only preparing to become full-fledged combat units in the future. But soon, commercial caravans will fly on horseback on tamed wyverns, performing their work at an inaccessible highest level for competitors. Thus, several more productive days have passed in stressful planning and thorough reorganization. Count Jerome began to seriously think to ask to reduce the workload or add more time on a good rest. Having burst into the working room, the breathless guy immediately apologized for his next delay. However, suddenly he saw opposite himself a calmly sitting Sabina, that very girl who recently seriously ill with contact with poisonous flowers, but now sat peacefully next to the other participants in the meeting. Salt Mudon asked him to sit down at the table as soon as possible, after which he turned to Osborne with a request to continue his important report on the current situation. As it turned out, very little time has passed since 3 guards were formed, but more than 20 prisoners were already in impromptu prisons. The main problem was that more than half of them were fugitives who arrived from other regions of the kingdom. Max immediately stated that these were dangerous criminals, who should have arrested everyone to one and put them under a reliable castle so that they would no longer cause serious troubles to civilians. However, the insightful hero understood that in this case, first of all, Max and all the other local rebels, they had to arrest the first as the main culprits of the uprising, because of which such a capable former leader as Count Jerome was expelled without good reason. Of course, Max persistently argued that it was a completely different matter. It was a legitimate self-defense aimed at protecting the original autonomy of the Korilla from the arbitrariness of the central government. However, the wise hero seemed unfair to believe that their rebellious actions were a noble struggle for freedom, while the activity of the commander of the Storm Detachment was qualified as petty theft. Max had no choice but to apologize to the Storm-respected knight. He only calmly explained that he did not want Max to forget about the root cause of the suffering of ordinary people. They now held an official meeting, and they could well discuss personal problems among themselves a little later. At this moment, the wise Sabina wanted to express her opinion. This clearly surprised the hero, and obviously, he wanted to carefully listen to his senior student, whose opinion was highly appreciated. The girl understood. Even if such a sane person as Osborne spoke in a similar way, it means that the settlement has an extremely negative public opinion about the fugitives. But hunting for cannibals was supposed to begin today, which was of great strategic importance. They could well put people in prison in the front echelons of dangerous hunting, thereby checking their true intentions. The hero liked a similar practical idea, so he allowed the student to continue to develop his thought. Soon, as it was agreed in advance, a special group went hunting for fierce icy franks. However, the goal that they initially pursued was suddenly lost among the snowy forest. At this critical moment, the first class of Gregory, Captain Storm, as well as a first-class fugitive named Lenin, came to a dangerous task. An experienced captain realized, as soon as the ogre moved far enough from their den, the hunters needed to carefully hide their presence and suddenly attack how they usually did it. After that, the detachment continued careful surveillance of this demonic creation, waiting for a suitable moment for a decisive blow. As soon as the time has come for a decisive attack, Lenin and Gregory suddenly attacked a powerful creature. Ogre screamed loudly from surprise, after which he began to feverishly look for his daring enemies among the snowy trees. At that moment, turning his massive head, the monster tried to demolish his head to Lenin in one fell swoop. The fugitive understood. It is already too late to try to evade this deadly attack of a powerful enemy. However, Captain Storm intervened at this critical second, ordering the guy to immediately fall on the frozen land. After that, an experienced warrior joined with his blades in a decisive attack on this ferocious monster, rewarding him with a couple of deep wounds. And when his faithful associates joined the main attack, the fate of the battle was finally decided. At that moment, Captain Storm recalled how the wise Sabina proposed putting a dangerous hunt in the vanguard. Of course, any sane assistant understood that it was like the use of these people as a living shield, rather an extreme measure than a humane decision. However, the insightful Sabina realized, if the teacher goes on a joint campaign with them, it would be much more human than just put them in prison. The Baron Blood is not one of those rulers who are easily scattered by human lives for the sake of dubious benefit. In this case, former criminals could begin to fight with honest people, proving their loyalty with business. Now the comrades discussing the victory admitted, even though it was a little risky, but they still managed to kill the fence. At that moment, when Lenin almost ruined the monster, this was vividly reminded of him that terrible moment when he was in prison and planned to escape from there. After a glorious victory, friends decided to go a little to drink, realizing that they would receive a decent reward for this dangerous work. Observing what was happening, Salt understood. The opinion of people about these former prisoners would certainly change for the better. In addition, it seems that they have become more united, thanks to combat cooperation. The hero could hardly believe that this brilliant decision was really proposed by his young student. The hunting participants did not even know that at that very moment, a monster hid in the dark carefully was watching them. Soon, residents continued to actively master the nearby forests of the region. On one of the next hunting expeditions, they heard some strange rustle among the snowy branches. As a result, one of the wary warriors decided to make a couple of warning shots from the bow towards a suspicious sound, so that all the hunters prepared for a possible battle. However, the released arrows pierced only into a tree, which means that the rustle they heard was just a noise of falling leaves. As a result, the young man went to pick up his arrows, then to examine other suspicious places. But at this fatal second, the hunters saw a 3-meter monster, ominously peering out of the wide trunk of an ancient tree. Around the same time, Count Geron proudly boasted that people in their settlement are no longer afraid of ferocious icy ogres. And of course, everyone perfectly understood. This became possible exclusively thanks to the wise assistance of their new lord. Everything went exactly according to a pre-drawn-up plan, so Salt Soul Moudon asked Geron to carefully inspect everyone so that the subordinates did not act too recklessly in the future. For some time, Geron continued to study various monsters, which were radically different from ordinary ogres or wyverns. He was just required to systematize the accumulated information to draw up a detailed catalog. At this tense moment, frightened warriors approached their camp. All participants in the expedition survived, but many were seriously injured and were now treated in the hospital. Obviously, the worried hero wanted to immediately know from Osborne what exactly happened in the forest. Then, approaching closer, the alarmed knight said that they, apparently, had a serious problem. An unknown monster appeared, radically different from the usual icy venue. The wounded fighter explained in detail that 2 of those who went with him to deal with the activity of the monsters underwent a sudden attack. This was definitely a completely different biological species. His whole body was covered with thick white fur, and he was incredibly huge. In appearance, the unknown creature was at least 3 meters in height. The usual ogre is approximately the same size, but this creature seemed much more reasonable than the usual opponents. Then the decisive Salt Moudon made it clear that the mass hunting was immediately over. He needed to act independently. If this creature was so dangerous, he could not risk the lives of subordinates. The hero ordered the faithful assistant to follow him as soon as he controlled that the territory was reliably numb from the possible penetration of the monster. Soon the warrior already fled through the snowy forest, realizing, if what people say corresponds to reality, then this monster could be exactly the creation that the hero already had an idea. He recalled the detailed explanations that the wise Edmund about the legendary northern creatures not so long ago. Therefore, the Baron applied its special ability to internal vision, which allows you to detect hidden auras. He immediately began to methodically scour the surroundings, until he finally found the creation, as if suitable for the description received. Therefore, armed with his reliable blade, a decisive warrior immediately attacked this mysterious monster. However, at the last moment, an unknown creature roared in fright, and the hero struck his blow. However, there was no particular sense in this attack, given that the monster was quite large and incredibly fast. However, the only thing that the hero seems to have achieved this attack was very angry with this Yeti. Most of all, Mudon Salt was surprised that he was growing now, and behaved like a frightened wild beast. It seems that the creature understood the intentions of the warrior, only meeting his gaze, and the expression of his eyes was like an angry beast, but they hid something else. For this reason, Salt Mudon decided to find out whether it belonged to the creature for human appearance or not. He was extremely curious to solve this riddle, but he understood that it was impossible to leave alive the one who causes serious harm to the inhabitants of his possessions. Therefore, decisively attacked a monster, the warrior asked that in the next life he was born an ordinary person and did not create evil. However, right before his decisive attack, unexpectedly, something very brightly shone with green light. And when the dazzling flash scattered, the mysterious monster disappeared literally before the salt was going to cut it. Perhaps the mysterious creature somehow created a difficult magic for salvation. Therefore, the puzzled hero began to feverishly look for information about such a green glow in his memory. He remembered that one day Luffy said, wizards of the 5th circle and higher could use advanced magic movements in space called teleportation. But most magicians remain at the modest level of the 1st and 2nd circles all their lives. In this case, the 5th circle of magic would be somewhere between the steps of the Hwangin, the enlightenment of fire, and the Hwangin, the enlightenment of wisdom. But how is this human-like creature, covered with thick white fur, could such an outstanding magic? In any case, everything that was left to assume was that the created spell was indeed a difficult teleportation. However, this did not mean at all that the hero could not catch a fugitive. Therefore, a decisive warrior came forward to the active search for the escaped Yeti. However, soon he could not find him. This big man really knew how to quickly hide. But, judging by the fact that Salt Mudon still felt someone else's presence, even with the help of a powerful teleportation, the creature could not go too far, a maximum of 2 kilometers. So, the mysterious Yeti definitely should be somewhere very close, and the patient hunting will continue. However, in this critical second, an attentive hero noticed a pile of branches, which they clearly tried to cover the entrance to the mysterious cave. The mysterious creature definitely wanted to hide this place from prying eyes. When the brave warrior went down the stone steps, he realized with amazement. It was an abandoned ancient library, keeping countless secrets of the past. It was extremely strange that such a majestic building arose as if from nowhere in the middle of an endless snowy field. There he also discovered the same Yeti, then he was very surprised. Of course, the insightful hero understood that the creature here wanted to hide from the persecution. But for reliable shelter, he should have hidden much better and more careful. However, at this unexpected moment, a mysterious creature humanly asked that Salt Mudon would not approach him. Hearing that the stranger knows how to speak the general language, the intrigued hero decided to ask him several important questions. As it turned out, Yeti was not at all an ordinary monster. He introduced himself as a Condor, a great warrior from Haori's legendary tribe. At that moment, behind the Baron, a dusty Geron appeared, who with a scientist explained that the Condor in the language of Haori warriors meant snow wind. The Count also said that he found them nearby. Traces of destruction and magical influences were discovered. He understood that they were subject only to such a powerful creature as their master, so he was able to find the Baron very quickly. Geron was extremely curious why it was a legendary creature from an ancient mythical clan in a similar abandoned library. It was about this circumstance that the hero was going to ask him first of all. The wise warrior wanted to find out where exactly this mysterious creature came from and what led him to their land. However, according to the frightened expression on Condor's face, it became clear. He again intends to slip as soon as possible. Then Salt Mudon was noticeably angry and strictly warned that he did not have much patience for such games in hide-and-seek. As a result, Yeti, almost crying with fear, admitted that he arrived from a distant Jairak. It was his hometown among the ice mountains. It immediately became obvious. In this case, in that distant city, there were many more similar ones. However, this circumstance did not seem fundamentally important for the current situation. Mudon Salt was more interested in why Condor decided to attack his people without any reason. Depending on the response received, the ruler will decide to have mercy on the alien or punish throughout the severity. However, the offended Yeti solemnly stated that he was a great warrior Haori and never killed, and did not harm peaceful people without a serious reason. Jiron was inclined to believe the words of Yeti. From what he saw, most of their warriors were simply seriously injured, but not a single one really happened. The hero then remembered the words of the very fighter whom he had met in the camp earlier, and he really did not start a conversation about the death of his comrades. Although the expression on his face was so frightened, as if someone from the detachment really died in a fight. Then the Condor explained in detail that it was people who attacked him first, ruthlessly expelling his ancestors from the sacred lands. He never attacked the first or something like that. Everything was exclusively self-defense. As a result, Salt Mudon, together with Jiron, understood. Most likely, it was their hunters who invaded the original territory of the Yeti, pursuing the icy festure. Realizing this annoying misunderstanding, the fair Salt Mudon asked Jiron to immediately heal their new friend from the wounds received. After that, the generous hero calmly turned to Condor with a peaceful request to tell more about their sacred lands. In return, he promised to give the strictest instructions to his people, so that they would never invade their possessions without permission again. From this noble sentence, Yeti literally shone from genuine happiness and relief. However, the hero was somewhat annoyed that Condor still talked with him unofficially, as if he could not express himself quite polite to communicate with the Lord. It was clearly visible. This fair reproach plunged the simple-minded creation into a certain stupor from embarrassment. Salt Mudon understood that nothing special could do anything with a creature who did not even really learn to speak according to all the rules of etiquette. Therefore, the wise ruler decided to generously not insist on strictly official appeal in these circumstances. At about this moment, diligent Jiron just finished therapeutic procedures, so all three decided to return to their camp for further discussion. However, the unexpectedly faithful assistant asked the master to linger. Since they were alone, he would like to turn to Salt Mudon with an important personal request. Somewhere at the same time, the wise Edmund realized with anxiety that about 3 months have passed since the deadline that their magic mosque promised. This circumstance made the old man worry a lot. Given all adverse circumstances, everything went to the fact that the guild would simply fall apart in the near future. Obviously, his friend did not completely understand why Edmund looked so depressed and disappointed. However, the worried man recalled the solemn promise of their mysterious magic swordsman. Then the hero said that we need to wait only 3 months, and he will certainly send the long-awaited delivery of rare ice. However, since then no encouraging news has been received, which could not but bother. Of course, the assistant asked Mr. Edmund to calm down and not lose hope. Mudon Salt is definitely not one of those people who frivolously violate these promises. And besides, at this very moment they saw a huge ice wyvern majestically flying to the guild building with an impressive load. After which the old people heard a familiar children's voice from a height. The young student, smiling joyfully, explained that, as solemnly promised, the long-awaited delivery of precious ice arrived at them. Edmund literally shone with happiness. After all, he always believed that Mr. Magic Swordsman would not deceive him and hold back his word. Henry was more striking in the incredible power of this monster, whose strength was equivalent to the whole army, and the royal warrior used such creatures only to deliver broken ice. Obviously, the man really wanted to know what was happening in the mysterious north. However, Sabina suddenly remembered that her master asked to convey something important. After that, the girl handed Edmund a sealed envelope, which must be delivered to the very person they talked about. At first, Edmund thoughtfully examined the message, but then immediately realized who this letter was intended. Events smoothly moved to the luxurious royal walls, where Her Highness Princess Aishild enjoyed an exquisite midday dinner. There was also an annoying Justin, who sweetly thanked the girl for graciously accepting his persistent proposal for the meeting. In addition, an annoying fan showed the princess with banal compliments like the fact that she becomes more beautiful with every day lived. And, of course, the educated Aishild politely thanked Sir Justin for such generous, albeit template words. Justin was clearly a little annoyed by the straightforwardness of this impregnable girl. She did not even try to portray a fake interested smile or pretending delight. However, in any case, Sir Duke received true pleasure only when he sought after a stubborn struggle. Therefore, he decided to be patient and wait a bit. Then he will certainly see a sincere smile on her usually indifferent aristocratic face. At that moment, the faithful maid approached the table and reported to the young lady that she had delivered a personal letter from Baron Vuga. The message was delivered to the office, so the girl immediately hurried there to immediately pick it up. Of course, Sir Justin was extremely upset that the mistress leaves him so early. He came specifically in the morning to see her and spend a precious time together. However, the princess only calmly reminded that 1 day a week is completely insufficient to fully train fencing. Therefore, she offered instead of their useless meetings to return and engage in improving combat skills. After that, the girl resolutely turned to her maid Lindsay, and they headed for the exit. The guy, looking after them, barely restrained his rage. Once again, the damned Baron Vuga spoiled all plans and destroyed the romantic atmosphere. Soon the excited girl was already sitting in her chambers, carefully reading the long-awaited letter. The mysterious warrior wanted to know how dear Aeshild was doing, and also said that he had everything excellent thanks to his happy talisman, which she generously awarded him before leaving. The northern lands turned out to be a truly beautiful place for a comfortable life. There were dazzling crystal caves and healing warm water from hot springs. Inside the spacious cave, where a pleasant climate reigned all year round, an amazing city was built under the poetic name of the White Castle. This is a really incredibly beautiful place, worthy of the princess. But there is one significant omission in it. The most important of all the shortcomings was that Aeshild was not there next to him. In itself, this sad fact made the paradise place seem somehow empty and meaningless. Therefore, he sent the girl a small elegant gift, expressing them his boundless longing for her. A tiny ice flower of unearthly beauty was attached to the letter, and the touching note ended with the sincere promise of the hero to contact the princess in the very nearby. The girl immediately cautiously pressed this magical gift to her trembling heart. She herself did not understand what had happened to her recently. However, Aeshild simply could not stop thinking about this mysterious person who so radically changed her measured life. In addition, admiring this amazing flower, the princess passionately wanted to look at the fabulous place where he grows among eternal ice. Therefore, she made a bold decision to personally go there and see everything on her own. Meanwhile, far in the north, the hero patiently tried to create another perfect ice flower. However, unfortunately, a fragile work of art scattered into small pieces with careless movement. This did not surprise the master at all. He had too much internal power, and it became difficult to control the pressure of energy when creating such elegant small details. However, at this concentrated second, his faithful assistant Geron quickly came running to the preoccupied master. He excitedly asked the hero to immediately go after him because they had a truly great discovery, literally a real jackpot of ancient knowledge. Then the hero casually threw the next failed flower into a huge bunch of unsuccessful attempts and trudged behind his excited assistant. Soon, the Baron recognized the amazing news. The very library that they discovered belonged to the powerful ancient wizard of an incredible level. Of course, Geron did not understand at all why the master did not look delighted with such a discovery. After all, it was really a grandiose historical event. In front of them lay the priceless heritage of an ancient magic family, a cornerstone for the revival of forgotten secret arts, a unique opportunity to go beyond the fifth circle of magic. However, suddenly a sensitive hero felt some strange unfamiliar energy emanating from the assistant. Therefore, he decided to find out what exactly was in Geron's secret pockets. The guy only fell silent guiltily, trying to hide a small bag under the folds of the mantle. However, with the help of powerful telekinesis, Saltmudden instantly pulled a hidden object to himself. As a result, the shamed Geron began to make excuses, claiming that there was nothing really important there. However, all people are aggravated by curiosity if they see something carefully hidden. What the Baron found inside he did not expect to see. The whole bag was stuffed with sparkling precious pebbles of incredible beauty. It turned out that these were legendary stones filled with concentrated mana, therefore the stones of mana were called. Of course, Saltmudden was extremely interested in where the Count was going to apply them, and why he decided to conceal from the master. Then the embarrassed guy honestly said that at present he was a wizard of the fourth circle. Geron almost reached the cherished fifth level, but rested a little against an invisible wall of restrictions. He thought that the magic stones of mana would help him overcome this insidious barrier and achieve a new level of power. The hero himself knew very well how painfully difficult to cross such a line, so he sincerely understood the feelings of his assistant. However, he believed that such a light act in this situation was not only wrong, but also extremely unacceptable. However, Geron recalled, if his magical abilities are radically improved, then this will only go for the benefit of the whole of the Kurils. Therefore, he respectfully asked for permission from the master to use the found treasures for development. However, the wise Salt of Mudon did not give such permission. He asked a fundamental question. If Geron takes advantage of mana stones and will be able to overcome the current barrier, what will he do further at the next obstacles? Most likely, it will again go in search of other mana stones to quickly solve problems. But this is completely not the path that is necessary for joining the new phase of development. It is necessary to make our own efforts in order to gain a true understanding of magical laws. A genuine growth occurs only over time and persistent efforts. No short ways to skill exist. At first, Geron was upset due to refusal, but then he realized that there was no reason for anger and resentment. Although this was upset, the wise gentleman was absolutely right in his decision. In addition, only thanks to his own tireless efforts, the Count reached the current level of the fourth circle. He remembered the wise words of his deceased teacher that magic cannot be learned, to be impatient and greedy to easy achievements. Therefore, the mentor asked to accept the slow natural course of things and move in the study of magic measuredly, step by step. Of course, the guy became ashamed that at some point he himself, without knowing that, began to forget the sacred instructions of his own grandfather. The hero was glad that Jaren independently coped with internal temptation. Then they decided to think about how it was still possible to effectively use these priceless stones. Magic crystals had an amazingly wide range of application. They could be used for almost any complex magic. The jewelry was also suitable for the rapid accumulation of mana, the creation of powerful protective barriers, and even for distant magical communication. That is how the hero was surprised to learn that with the help of such stones, it was possible to communicate at great distances, without even attracting an experienced magician for this. The guy calmly explained, if he puts a special communication spell on the prepared stone, then communication will become possible even for people who are completely unable to use magic, and the quality of such a connection will be one of the best among the known methods. With such excellent quality of mana stones, they can easily maintain constant connection even with the distant Empire Seba, which was behind the endless sea on another continent. Then the wise hero decided to find out whether his faithful friend guesses the most important truth in the art of government. The most critical factor was the speed of dissemination of information between the regions. The rules of the political game have changed dramatically, depending on who could provide vital information faster and more. Therefore, the far-sighted Baron immediately ordered his talented assistant to turn absolutely all mana stones into special communication stones right now, without losing precious time. Soon, an inspired hero gathered with his faithful friends to carefully check the newly combined magical walkie-talkie in the field. Very soon he heard Comrade Jake's clear voice, transmitted through the crystal. The hero literally almost shone from the genuine joy of such success, so he immediately wanted to know where the tester was now. It turned out that Jake on his faithful wyvern was 10 kilometers from their white castle. In addition, he could excellently hear every word, which unequivocally indicated that magic stones really work without the slightest interruption. The Baron was sincerely happy that their revolutionary communication experiment was brilliantly successfully. The sound was transmitted crystal clean, without any interference or distortions. Salt also warned that in the future he would regularly contact the warrior on this channel to coordinate actions, which clearly pleased Jake. However, the next second, when the hero ordered his subordinate to return home immediately, he heard him clearly lolled at the other end of the connection. Therefore, strongly squeezing the stone in the palm of his hand, the angry lord immediately ordered Osborne, as soon as Jake returned to the castle, significantly increase the intensity of his training as a punishment. At this very moment, the rest of the students just returned to their winged pets in order to respectfully greet their wise teacher. The hero immediately asked them to go to the main hall. It was urgent to find out what happened during their intelligence mission. Thus, soon everyone gathered at a large oak table in order to thoroughly discuss important news from the outside world. However, the hero clearly did not like the letter from Mr. Edmund. He was silent for a long time, carefully reading an alarming message. As it turned out, shortly before that, Salt Mudan asked Edmund to collect and record detailed information about the political situation in neighboring countries. An old friend wrote everything quite thoroughly, but in this vast letter one specific name was mentioned, Inaz. For this reason, the Baron experienced some rather strange, anxious feeling that could not explain. The hero decided to directly ask his comrades whether any of them had ever heard this mysterious name. Captain Storm immediately responded first. He personally did not see this legendary person, so his information could not be entirely accurate. However, according to stubborn rumors, Inaz was the great master of the sword, whose art exceeded ordinary performances. All those present immediately staggered after these amazing words. After all, the great master of the sword is much higher than the usual master of the sword. It seemed that on this continent no higher rank could not be among swordsmen. However, at the same moment the worried hero imperiously ordered everyone to shut up and let him think. The Baron himself at this time began to feverishly reflect on what he heard. As far as he understood from past experience, the great master of the sword was tantamount to the warrior of the level of the Kingdom of Harmony on the Central Plains. A person who is at a similar level of power could create manifestations of the aura of the sword, which made it almost invulnerable. Arriving at this world, Salt Mudan with disappointment heard that only about 10 people in the entire kingdom owned the basic aura of the sword. It was a rather boring situation, to be the only strong warrior and not have a worthy opponent to check the skills. The hero could not even think that suddenly a master of the level of the Kingdom of Harmony appeared. At least now he may be able to truly compete with someone in an honest match. First of all, the Baron passionately wanted to meet this person as with the strongest master of the sword of this mysterious world. Then the storm recalled another important and very strange detail regarding the martial art of this legendary warrior. They said that when Inaz waved his blade in battle, an amazing aroma of flowering plum began to spread around him. Remembering such an unusual art with a characteristic plum smell, the hero realized this was very similar to the unique technique of the clan of the Fire Mountain. Only they were capable of such aromatic manifestations among all martial arts during the battle. Therefore, the hero crept in serious thoughts. Perhaps someone else from the Central Plains somehow arrived in this world, except for himself. Salt Madon vividly recalled those distant times when he united all the Central Plains under his rule. Then he first personally saw a bewitching art with the aroma of the flowering plum belonging to the clan of the Fiery Mountain. Of course, he sincerely admired the outstanding abilities of the head of that ancient clan. His sword was truly magnificent. However, the enemy was beyond the power of the then young warrior. The head of the clan only looked displeased at the Salt of Mudon, understanding bitterly that if his talented student was nearby, the result of the fight would be completely different. It was about that promising guy who mysteriously disappeared several days before the decisive battle. The teacher was absolutely sure that the young warrior simply disappeared during a secluded training in the mountains. Everything indicated that he simply evaporated without a trace from this world for unknown reasons. Of course, at that moment, Salt Mudon considered it some unconvincing excuse for the defeated enemy. However, apparently, the head of the clan was not so far from the truth as it seemed then. Also, the curious Jerome became interested in what was still written in an alarming letter from Edmund. But there was nothing more particularly interesting there, only the information that the kingdom officially sends a group of observers to their region. Obviously, all those present immediately shouted so loudly that it seems that even the massive walls of the city shuddered from this news. And Salt Mudon, on the contrary, did not at all see in this planned testing of a special reason for panic and anxiety. Jerome patiently explained to the master that there were only two main reasons for the sudden arrival of the royal group of observers: solemn inspection tours or search and capture of state traitors. They must have been prepared for everything, especially considering that high guests would arrive soon. When the worried Jerome wanted to know exactly how much time they had to prepare, the hero significantly drew in the air the hour of the pig. So they reasoned seriously and did not know at all that these very observers had already arrived in their possessions. All the inhabitants were amazed that even royal knights in complete combat vestment unexpectedly visited them. At this solemn moment, a loud voice was filed by the arrogant Justin, who officially turned to the Lord of the White Castle, Baron Vuga, and imperiously ordered him to immediately go down in order to appropriately greet the attached group of observers. The hero calmly went down and courteously greeted Justin, with whom he had not seen personally for a long time. Only smiling slyly, the Baron decided to sarcastically ask how the hand of a young aristocrat feels himself, and whether she had not hurt recently after their memorable meeting. All witnesses froze in shock, watching the Salt of Mudon behave with this high-ranking young man, as if completely forgetting the strict rules of this class world. What the Baron was doing now could be regarded at all as a treason. At this critical moment, the hero only grinned, looking at all these tense soldiers. Then he politely asked the princess to stop hiding behind the guards and finally go out to him for a personal meeting. At this moment, the excited Aeshild asked the hero to refrain from threatening behavior towards official representatives of the crown. After that, the girl decided to calmly ask how all this time the Baron lived in her distant possessions. Obviously, the princess soon went on a detailed tour of the hero's possessions in order to see the described miracles with her own eyes. She literally held her breath when she first saw a dazzling crystal cave, about which Salt Mudon so poetically mentioned in her letter. Also, a curious girl passionately wanted to see the very healing hot springs that she had heard so much about. Therefore, gallant Salt Mudon decided to personally conduct it and show all local attractions. So they learned the true purpose of the visit. The group of observers made an ordinary royal inspection tour of distant provinces. Aeshild honestly admitted that after reading his touching letter, she convinced her father to include the northern lands in the route of a trip with a group of observers. Salt Mudon was sincerely surprised at such a bold and direct act of a beauty, after which he warmly mentioned the very happy talisman that the girl gave him goodbye, which obviously embarrassed her. The hero was struck by the fact that Aeshild was even embarrassed by such insignificant references. She was completely no different from her lover in a past life. In addition, with their last meeting, a long spiritual journey awaited him. First of all, in order to avenge the deceased bride, he won the entire continent with Muri with iron and blood. After long wanderings and searches, he finally met her here in this new world. And although her appearance changed a little, he was more than just reunite with his beloved woman, even in a new appearance. When they reached this very picturesque hot source, the girl sincerely admired his natural beauty among ice landscapes. However, gently hugging Aishild, Salt Mudan romantically admitted that she was much more beautiful than any natural miracles in his loving eyes. The hero honestly admitted to the princess that he was very bored with her all this endlessly for the time of separation. However, the Baron himself did not notice how, at this emotional moment, he accidentally called her the name of Cluin. That was the name of his lover in a past life. Obviously, after this painful reservation, the princess began to persistently find out who this mysterious bumber is. And the confused Salt Mudan only scaredly apologized for his careless words, not knowing how to explain the situation. Then Aischild bitterly admitted that she really liked how he looked at her. In his eyes she always felt sincere affection and tenderness. However, only today the girl realized that this deep attachment of the Baron was not aimed at her at all, but rather at a mysterious woman named Cleanne. Obviously, the hero desperately tried to say something, to somehow justify himself before the offended Aishild. However, the princess only closed his mouth with her hand, not wanting to listen to explanations. She explained that she did not want to hear anything from him, and he did not need to say anything in his excuse. After which the girl turned away, hiding treacherous tears, and hastily left the source. Thus, Salt Mudan, without understanding it, gave an exhaustive answer to her painful question about his true feelings. At that tragic moment, the guy was speechless, and did not know at all what to say to correct the situation. Even if he told the girl the whole truth about the reincarnation and relocation of souls, the Baron could not adequately explain all those years and accumulated emotions that tormented his heart. Therefore, wobbly wandering around the cold, snowy seashore, he painfully wondered what to do in this hopeless situation. And at that moment, the hired killer suddenly ran into him from behind with his deadly blade. A professional killer aimed directly into the head of an unsuspecting victim. Soon, white snow was painted with a scarlet blood from the strike. Shortly before this fateful moment, an insidious Justin with a tempting offer turned to an experienced hired killer. And now the Duke's son was looking forward to while a professional named Arvan informs him a thorough report on a successfully completed task. It was impossible to describe in words the wild joy of Justin when he found out that a sudden attack on the hated Salt of Mudon was crowned with complete success. At this time, a small ice pendant was still lying on the frozen earth, the very gift that the hero created to search for a lover. Meanwhile, the princess was in her temporary residence in a white castle. She still sobbed bitterly and brutally reproached herself for how sorry she looked in this situation. Enchild never before, without stopping after she treated her so unceremoniously. She still clearly remembered the bewildered face of the hero during their last conversation. However, the princess considered herself a naive fool every time she remembered this painful episode. In addition, if she really was the road to the hero, he at least once tried to keep her or explain the situation. At that moment, the soldiers outside the door officially declared Her Highness about the arrival of the late visitor. Aishild literally transformed with happiness, thinking that it could be a baron who came to apologize. When she, having dressed rapidly, opened the door, the princess decided to coquettishly ask what brought the baron at such a late night hour. The girl naively believed that he came to sincerely ask for forgiveness for the pain caused. But what she saw literally struck on the spot. In front of her stood an angry, grinning Justin, who at that moment already dealt with all her faithful subordinates. With a demonic smile, he apologized for impending her at such a late hour. At this terrifying moment, the girl tried to reach the door handle to close it and block the entrance. However, Justino cut the door with his sword with lightning speed, so that only a miserable sliver remained in the princess's hands. After that, the distraught aristocrat also smashed all the furniture in the room into chips, and the girl managed to dodge and fly aside in the last second. Then she realized, to cut the massive door in an instant, one could only with a sword filled with concentrated magic. At this critical moment, the princess was not speechless and indignantly asked how Justin dared to behave like that. She recalled that he dared to harm the royal support members and also invaded her personal residence without any permission. Justin only laughed ominously. After all, he knew in advance what exactly she would say and what punishment he allegedly waits in the future. However, the distraught heir only condescendingly recalled that it was the princess who was rude and unceremonious with him from the very beginning of their acquaintance. All this time she continued to ignore his sincere feelings and signs of attention, and then suddenly began to cling to some guy who appeared literally from nowhere. The girl did not understand why he committed such serious crimes because of such, in her opinion, nonsense. The princess threatened that Baron Blue would not leave without attention, given that Justin is rampant and creates lawlessness on his lands. However, Justin laughed even stronger and more malicious, amazed that the princess hoped so naively for the help of the dead man. Looking at her shock and horror, the triumphant son of the Duke explained that he sent an elite detachment of the murderers for Salt Moudon. Now that professional killers have succeeded in a sudden attack, no one can even find his body among snow expanses. However, the girl, until the last moment, did not believe in the death of the hero and, clenching his fists, desperately waited for the Baron to save her from this nightmare. And in this fateful moment he really appeared in the doorway. With one powerful blow, the warrior drove the body of a distraught guy into a stone wall with such force that even a thick masonry broke into several massive parts. Having dealt with the attacker, the hero immediately returned to the mistress with a calm, affectionate smile, as if nothing special happened. After that, the Baron gently explained that everything was in order with him, and carefully looked at the girl to make sure that this villain did not create anything wrong with her. However, the warrior did not have time to do anything, like the magical blade, which was operated by the son of the Duke, suddenly flew into him again, controlled by magical power. As a result, a tense battle ensued between the hero and the enchanted sword. Then the amazed Baron realized that this blade was skillfully controlled using concentrated internal energy of the owner. At this critical moment, an enchanted blade quickly returned to his owner. The frightened princess began to peer anxiously into the distance, and they saw the demonic forces of darkness surrounding the enemy. It was clearly visible. Justin clearly carefully prepared for this decisive attack, leaving nothing on the will. Shortly before this fatal event, the heir came to his influential father, frankly admitting that he passionately wants to finally kill such an impudent bastard, like the Salt of Moudon. He persistently asked the Duke to allow him to use the elite group of hired killers. The son sincerely believed that professional killers are able to eliminate even a skillful master of the sword, and there would be no serious problems at all. However, the wise man understood that this would be completely insufficient against such an enemy. If his son really intended to kill the Baron, then he should have prepared for this very thoroughly. The Baron carefully looked at the magic sword in the hands of Justin, who was completely controlled by the owner of the owner, and also created protective magic armor. At that moment, a deadly attack rushed towards the princess, and in the last seconds the Baron managed to push the lady away from himself, taking a blow to himself. Justin, coming closer to the defeated enemy, enjoyed the power of his magical armor and an enchanted sword. The aristocrat understood. With this artifact, he will be able to kill even the legendary great master of the sword. Observing the damage that his blow, the heir was not able to calm his wild joy. Even the ancient cave itself began to split into parts threateningly under the influence of magical power. The Duke's son felt his unconditional superiority, and even secretly rejoiced that the hired killers still screwed up. Now he will be able to kill this hated scoundrel with his own hands and enjoy revenge in full. At this tense moment, the frightened princess noticed the hero's bloodied hand. However, he strictly ordered her not to approach and stay at a safe distance. All that Eskild had to do is only hope and pray that the Baron will return to her alive and sound. However, the warrior only awarded the girl with a gentle, encouraging smile, asking to hide and not worry about anything in vain. After which he resolutely rose to fight again with his arrogant enemy. Salt Moudon honestly noticed that the guy had changed a lot from the moment of their past meetings, gaining magical power. However, deep down he remained the same unrelenting weakling. Of course, an arrogant aristocrat believed that the hero was simply trying to intimidate him again with his empty threats and bragging. Therefore, Justin began to violently attack the enemy with an enchanted blade. However, the Baron with his bare hands easily fought off this attack, demonstrating its superiority. At that moment, the distraught Justin with his whole body flew at him, trying to kill with one decisive blow. But the hero only managed to stop this blow with one hand. The sword did not even scratch his skin. Two fighters simply flew away from each other a few meters from recoil. However, Justin immediately approached, continuing to mercilessly attack. He drove the Salt of Moudon into a critical situation when he had nowhere to retreat. In addition, the Baron was pretty exhausted after a recent fight with professional mercenaries. It was a perfect chance to finally kill him. Therefore, Justin only laughed viciously, because the death of his sworn enemy was close as never before. However, in an instant, when the hero became truly serious, the magic armor began to quickly fly from the enemy's body into small pieces. In addition, the Baron definitely struck Justin's wounded hand, and in the same place where he had an old injury. Immediately, painfully sinking to his knees, the guy grabbed his wounded hand, desperately trying to recover from the shock. The hero was happy that he managed to drive a dangerous fighter away into the forest. At such a safe distance, the enemy would never have managed to touch Madam Princess with an accidental attack. Only then did the stunned guy realize to pretend to be wounded was the original cunning plan of the wise hero, and Salt Moudon calmly explained that the beast driven into a corner is especially dangerous. Even a weak mouse would bite the cat if it is pressed against the wall. But the warrior was sincerely surprised that such an insignificant rat, like this aristocrat, dared to threaten the princess herself. Of course, Justin became furious from the fact that the hero still dares to underestimate and humiliate him. However, Salt Moudon did not underestimate him at all. He was extremely objective, and also extremely careful, because he could not afford to lose his beloved again. As a result, the Baron made another crushing blow until the enemy's magical armor finally fell apart into the smallest pieces. Obviously, the bewildered Justin did not understand to the last what had happened to her. In addition, he no longer felt the streams of mana in his body and could not control it. The aristocrat did not expect to understand that the Baron was completely destroyed by the attack by Dantan, the energy center. From now on and again he will never be able to use magical power in principle. It was less punishment for his sins. Then, in despair, Justin tried to fly into a hero with ordinary fists. However, the Baron gave him such a deafening slap in the face that he even picked up several teeth. The warrior hoped that after such a punishment, the aristocrat would spend the rest of his life in deep repentance. Now the former magician learns on himself what it feels like to be weak and defenseless. Just at this solemn moment, the long-awaited dawn finally came. It was time to return home to the hero, because probably the princess waited with anxiously. So Justin's insidious plan was finally ripped off, and the villain himself, punished by the fact that she could no longer use Manu, was thrown into a gloomy prison. Now all that the hero remained was to conduct a romantic date with his lover. However, to his great shock, he did not expect to see such a picture at all. The Baron noticed how Aeschild is friendly holding the hands of his own assistant Geron. 15 minutes before this awkward moment, the hero gathered all his people in order to declare large-scale searches. He also promised that anyone who will find the thing he needs first will receive a generous monetary reward. Salt Moudon was looking for his precious ice pendant, which lost when he was ambushed by hired killers. By this moment, the Baron had already found out everything about the attackers. These were experienced professional killers. It was even surprising that Salt Moudon managed to fight off their coordinated attack. However, although the killers moved secretly and prudently, in general they turned out to be rather weak opponents. The hero also explained to his subordinates, if he were in a slightly better shape, he would not even receive scratches from their blades. At that moment, the princess herself appeared. As she guessed, Salt Moudon lost an expensive thing for herself, and she was very ashamed of what had happened. After all, if he immediately rushed in search, then perhaps the pendant would be found. But the hero went to save her from Justin, because of which the jewel was bored with snow during a snowstorm. Obviously, the Baron tried to calm the excited princess. In addition, he jokingly accused his assistant Geron of the loss of Coulon. And at that moment the princess ran past the Salt of Moudon. Aeschild immediately joyfully rushed to Count Geron von Kruin. Obviously, the princess was extremely interested in what the Count did here, because she heard that he was mysteriously missing. Geron did not even know how to justify himself for his unexpected appearance. Of course, he understood that the girl was sincerely glad to find him alive and healthy. However, such a stormy greeting slightly embarrassed him, and in principle, it is not in vain. After all, at that moment the former Count felt a murderous aura on his body. Salt Moudon was clearly interested in finding out when and how these two became so close friends. Of course, the princess tried to justify herself, claiming that the Baron misunderstood and interpreted. Even the faithful maid suggested that the princess clarify the misunderstanding in detail. So soon the Salt Moudon recognized the striking truth. Geron was the person whom the princess respected and appreciated in this world. She considered him a truly outstanding and noble person. The Count was a rare aristocrat who sincerely cared for his people, and not about personal benefits. Aeschild was so sorry when he was unfairly sent to this northern wilderness. And when the princess found out that he was missing, she was very painful and anxious. Salt Moudon was struck by what was heard. After all, Geron never told him about it. And obviously, no one in his right mind will boast of his own good deeds before others. However, she remained a mystery why the princess spoke of Geron in the past tense as a deceased. However, the reason was quite simple. Now the princess learned about the heroic transformation that happened to Geron thanks to the influence of the Baron. She herself even embarrassed and covered with a treacherous blush. And then with shame, she hastily ran away, justifying herself with the search for the missing pendant. The maid, obviously, darted after her mistress in order to support her. Without understanding it, the girl went to the very clearing where the mercenaries' attack occurred. Soon the princess really found that shining pendant among snowdrifts. Yes, it was exactly the thing that Baron was so desperately looking for. Aeshild decided to immediately go to him and report the good news. Judging by how the Salt Mudon looked at that moment, this elegant pendant was probably connected with the same mysterious girl named Clyan. And when the princess thought about it, she had the same sad expression on her face as the Baron himself. The maid gently asked the princess to be not worried about anything. She was convinced the Baron thinks about the lady exactly as much as she thinks about him. Then the girl smiled sadly with these words. At first, Aeshild was fighting to the ghost of the past, but now she just became curious, without any anger. She wanted to know, what kind of woman could conquer the heart of such a person in a past life? In the vision of that life, Swing brought a magic flower to his stern father, but in the end he turned out to be angry with a similar gift. In addition, the father menacingly ordered his daughter to immediately remove such stupidity. He considered it a quirk. He did not believe in a flower that bloated in the name of imaginary true love. The man rudely reminded his daughter that she had already had an appointed groom according to a political calculation. Therefore, he ordered her to stop being distracted by all kinds of absurdities, and it is better to prepare for the wedding that he arranged for her with an influential ally. Swarf only bitterly cried, not understanding how she should turn a blind eye to such injustice. The girl reminded her father it was a lotus of true love, which blooms only from sincere feelings. This could be considered a sign of family and blessed souls. But even when he saw such a miracle, his father still continued to repeat about some kind of political marriage. Apparently, the profitable union was more important to him more than his own daughter. Obviously, it was difficult for his father to hear these painful words. But Kvanen understood her father throws her exactly the same as her mother once betrayed her for the sake of a political alliance. However, tired of listening to all this, a cruel man ordered the guard to lock the rebellious daughter in the ice palace until the wedding itself, and not to lower her eyes off her. Then the girl understood with bitterness. It would be better if she had never returned home after meeting with her lover. After this heavy sleep, Princess Aeshild finally came to her senses, breathing heavily. Of course, this dream was a real nightmare that she could not understand and explain. Soon the girl went to hot sources to admire them with the hero. But all her thoughts were occupied by the very mysterious woman who was in a strange vision. Salt Mudon himself, seeing the depressed state of the princess, decided to delicately find out what was happening to her. However, Aeshild only embarrassedly denied, claiming that everything was fine and he had nothing to worry about. Salt Mudon invited the girl to go on a short journey to slightly clear her mind from disturbing thoughts. It seems that this unexpected proposal made not only the Aeshild itself, but also her devoted maid to worry. Soon they arrived at a special platform, where a magnificent ice wyvern flew. Obviously, the mistress was amazed when she saw such a powerful beast near, and her maid was scared to herself half to death. This fantastic creature seemed amazing. She had never seen such tamed wyverns in reality. The Baron calmly explained that they were all trained from birth. Therefore, the winged pets are very friendly to people, and the girl had nothing to fear. At that moment, Mr. Jerome also approached them, telling Baron that everything was carefully prepared for flight. The Count also prepared the special that the hero personally asked him for the princess. At that moment, a small fluffy lump landed next to the servant. Jerome only apologized for him, because this baby did not want to scare her. It was a little Condor, Yeti from Hari tribe. Obviously, the girl could not believe what they had in mind, the legendary tribe, which was mentioned in ancient traditions, that the Yeti live in the inaccessible snowfields of the distant north. The princess never thought that children of this mythical race could be so small and cute creatures. Jerome seemed to be sincerely glad that the girl liked the baby, and did not scare her with his unusual look. Salt Mudon only cordially thanked the guy for the assistance provided in the organization of the meeting. In fact, shortly before that, the Baron asked Jerome to reduce their great friend Condor with the help of magic so that the princess was not afraid at the first meeting. And although the Count doubted the success of such a spell, everything was brilliantly succeeded, and Aeshild was sincerely happy to get to know Yeti. At this exciting moment, the hero invited them to go on a trip. After that, the Baron decided to saddle his faithful wyvern named Lilith, a majestic creation with an overflowing scales. Then he gallantly held out his hand to the princess in order to help her climb onto the back of this manual dragon. And so together, they soon solemnly flew away from their white castle in an unknown direction. At first, the girl was even a little scared. She first rose so high above the ground and did not know what to expect. But since there was a reliable Baron next to her, Aeshild knew that everything would be in order with her. Salt Mudon only gently asked the princess to dare to open her eyes and at least looked around a little. And soon she saw what made her heart tremble with delight. They flew so high that they were even higher than the fluffy clouds themselves. The princess was amazed at this unearthly beauty, and she really became much better in her soul. The girl was very touched by the fact that the hero all this time was so carefully worried about her depressed state. Then, clinging closer to the Baron, Aishild asked to fly with all her might. And in the end, under her joyful, enthusiastic scream, they rushed on the wyvern even more rapidly through the heavenly expanses. Soon, the air couple arrived at the moon and its trading company. The girl was surprised by an unexpected visit and politely reminded the master that her visits should be warned in advance to prepare a worthy meeting. However, the hero explained, he was too far from the White Castle and could not contact them through magic stones. The Baron also asked the moon to report all current trade issues to Count Geron, and they would deal with things to return it. All this time, Salt Mudon was going to romantically have dinner with Aishild in the nearest restaurant in order to complete the affairs by the time they returned to the castle. At this pleasant time, the girl from the veranda admired a beautiful opening look. It was a picturesque village with a luxurious flowering park, which the hero specially prepared for her as a surprise. At that moment, for some reason, Aishild carefully examined the ice flower in the Baron's pendant. For an unknown reason, now this graceful flower seemed very familiar to her, as if she had seen him before. Suddenly, the princess realized she saw this flower in her mysterious dream. She even thoughtfully frowned, trying to recall the details of the vision. When Mudon noticed this, the girl honestly admitted that she had a strange and alarming dream last night. There were people who wore clothes and lived in houses, which she had never seen in reality before. In a dream, she seemed to be a little more than 20 years old. She was a woman with fair skin, long black hair, and sad dark eyes. In that vision, she always had a sad expression on her face, because the girl was deeply in love, but her father brutally tried to make her marry a political calculation. One way or another, it was a very strange and painful dream. The hero only smiled sadly and gently stroked his precious pendant, realizing Aishild simply begins to remember the memories from a past life when she was fluent. At that moment, the princess realized that in a dream someone was desperately called by name. And it seems this person was called Goga, which meant the older brother in the ancient language. Throughout his life, the Salt of Mudon so affectionately called only one person, and it was his lover Swarf. The girl herself noticed that something was happening with the hero. His face became thoughtful and sad. However, the Baron only apologized, admitting that he was lost in his memories for a while. Then he asked the princess to sit at the table, because the exquisite food was already cooling down. However, Aishild also had an important request for the master. She felt that there was a certain distance between them due to the fact that he continued to call her officially the princess. The girl would like that from this moment all officiality between them would finally disappear. She would be very glad if he called her just by name, without titles. Similar words once said to him Swarf in a past life. Therefore, smiling gently, the hero agreed to follow the will of his lover. The late evening, making sure that the lord had enjoyed dinner, a business Geron came to him. After the negotiations with the trading company, the count had something to report. However, it turned out to be the princess never heard the name of the company with which they were doing. It turned out that such a company did not exist within their kingdom, and the hero realized that he did not explain the situation at all. The company was outside the kingdom of Drake. Specifically, this trading organization was from the kingdom of Kai, a powerful nation in the northwest of the continent, which is ruled exclusively by the queen. This state is also known as the Kingdom of Women, since there the ruling class consists of a fair sex. The Royal Order of Kaya Knights, consisting exclusively of women warriors, is especially famous. Of course, the princess knew that their trade affairs were developing successfully, but did not expect that the Kingdom of Kai would become a partner. Eskild sincerely hoped that her appearance here would not entail any diplomatic problems with the neighboring state. At that moment, a curious girl asked Geron to continue her fascinating story about trade successes. Therefore, the count explained in detail that the skin of various northern creatures that they delivered to Kai's kingdom was incredible among the local nobility. The business moon today has made an excellent commercial proposal for business development. She offered to build her own factory in order to immediately produce and sell finished leather products and not just raw materials. The hero did not understand why unnecessary movements needed, because ordinary skin and without additional processing was sold just with a bang. However, in the kingdom of Kai, the ruler and most influential aristocrats were women. If they begin to produce clothes and luxurious bags of rare materials, then aristocrats and members of the royal family will certainly appeal to this. Such goods will become a real trend among the nobility. and merchants will earn even more gold. In addition, the experienced moon said that she knew the famous master of leather products from the Kari moon. She confidently stated that they could begin large-scale production as soon as the ambitious plan is approved by the leadership. Then the hero realized this was an excellent decision to appoint it at the head of the trading company. The Baron agreed to provide the company with everything necessary so the team could safely begin to implement the project. Jiron also proudly explained that their unique skin was so popular among buyers that it was completely sold out on the first day of bringing goods to the markets. However, the hero was more worried about the fact that right now they saw some kind of alarming explosion in the city. In addition, the source of fire was very close to the location of their company. The merchants were also worried that a strong wind could spread the flame to their building, destroying all the goods. Therefore, decisive Salt Mudon decided to personally go to check what happened in the city. Baron asked Jiron to carefully guard the princess during his absence. Obviously, Aeshield also wanted to go with the hero to the scene. However, he gently explained that this would take only a moment, and very soon he would return to her safely. After which the warrior quickly flew to the place of the tragic incident. However, the princess could not calmly sit back in such a situation. Therefore, she invited Jiron to hurry and follow the Baron in order to provide assistance. At this time, an elderly woman sobbed bitterly, watching how her store was burning, to which she dedicated her whole life. Obviously, local residents carried buckets with water, desperately trying to extinguish this destructive fire. However, this flame was literally hellish, devouring everything in its path. The fire turned out to be really larger than Salt Mudon initially assumed, assessing the situation from afar. At this critical moment, the princess arrived at the scene with the faithful assistant. Aeshield apologized to the Baron for disobeying his request to stay safe. She was too excited about what was happening and could not calmly sit back, knowing that people were suffering. The hero could not blame her for this. If they had changed places, he would have acted exactly the same. However, suddenly, among the raging fire, the Baron felt something strange and anxious. Therefore he, without warning anyone, immediately darted right into the very heart of the flame. After that, the warrior knocked out a window frame with a powerful blow and immediately began to freeze everything around with his divine ice arrows. At that moment, he noticed a girl who had lost consciousness from smoke among the wreckage. Immediately checking her pulse, the Baron was convinced that the victim was still alive. It was very lucky that Salt Mudon even noticed her in such a critical situation. In addition, by some miracle, she managed to survive a truly massive fire that could easily kill an ordinary person. At this dangerous moment, the burning fragments of the beams flying to the hero almost landed him right in the eye. Therefore, he instantly froze absolutely the entire building, forcing the destructive fire to finally go out. Watching this incredible sight, the amazed Jiron realized it was the magic of the 8th or even the 9th circle of ice, accessible only to the greatest magicians. At this triumphant moment, an unharmed Baron came out of the completely icy room, carefully carrying the injured girl on his shoulders. Shortly before the fire, this mysterious girl talked with one of her assistants. He warned her that they were discovered signs of the preparatory rebellion against her power. Obviously, she did not understand who dared to challenge her in such an impudent way. However, at that moment, the silhouette of her assistant has already begun to blur. And so this mysterious fire occurred, arranged by unknown enemies. Soon the victim woke up in an unknown cozy room. When the girl went out into the common room, she saw people who sat quietly and rested at a large table. Immediately the business moon rose, noticing the guest to politely find out how she feels after the nightmare experienced. However, the victim was extremely interesting to find out what kind of mysterious place this is. When the moon spoke about the Karalun Trading Company, the lady remembered that she had heard of her growing popularity recently thanks to the trade of rare skin. But still, she did not know how these people recognized her and why they decided to help. It turned out that the saviors were from the village of Karalun, who was in the far north of the Kingdom of Drake. Their trading company was called in honor of their native village, from where they all came. After which the moon pointed to the man sitting at the table of the Lord, who heroically saved the stranger from the flaming building. It was Baron Blue, who, risking his life, pulled her out of a deadly trap. Immediately, going up to the savior, a grateful girl cordially thanked the master for his noble act. After which she courteously introduced herself to those present. Her name was Princess Schiller McMafen, and from this stunning news all the mouths opened widely at the table. After all, in front of them was the legendary Princess Schiller, who was the second princess of the powerful kingdom of Kai. She reached the prestigious level of the Master of the Sword at 25 and now led the elite Royal Knightly Order. The princess was a famous person not only in his kingdom, but also far beyond his borders. The embarrassed Moon immediately bowed respectfully, apologizing for her involuntary rudeness. However, Since these ordinary people were not the subjects of the kingdom of Kai, the foreign princess generously decided to forget that they did not recognize her at once. Eskild was in a real shock. Of all people in the world, she met with an influential foreign princess. If such news leaks into diplomatic circles, this will turn into a serious international scandal. The insightful hero noticed that the girl clearly began to worry greatly due to possible consequences. The noble Schiller itself solemnly promised to personally reward the hero to save her precious life. As soon as they finished with a meal, everyone could go to her luxurious palace for the presentation of the award. However, with all due respect, Salt Madon politely abandoned this generous proposal, explaining that he should return home to his duties. Obviously, the second princess clearly did not expect to hear such a refusal from a simple baron. The experimental moon understood that he was traditionally considered a huge insult to the royal family in the kingdom of Kaya. Therefore, the merchant immediately tried to tactfully explain that their lord was simply very worried about the princess and does not know how to behave in a similar situation. To discharge the tense atmosphere, the moon decided to translate the topic of the conversation and delicately find out how the princess was in a burning building. Then Schiller remembered the true culprit of the incident. It was Baron Palatine Rose, whom she maintained before this fateful moment. But he treacherously dared to try to kill her. However, she could not talk about these political intrigues. The princess only carefully explained that Palatine Rose turned out to be a coward who was afraid to face her to face in an honest duel. Therefore, he tried to poison her with poison, and the arson of the building was probably arranged to make sure that he definitely dealt with her. One way or another, Schiller wanted to dignally repay Salt to Mudon for her wonderful salvation. The princess persistently asked the hero to name the desired reward for the feat. However, Salt Mudon noted that with all due respect, the girl looked as if something was vital from them. Obviously, the proud princess was outraged by how this impudent commoner behaves in relation to the royal person. However, without reacting to an indirect insult, the unflappable hero suggested that she just eat with him. At dinner, Schiller thought why the mysterious baron stubbornly refused any reward. If he had not been her savior, for such insolence, she would have long left him into a gloomy prison. However, at that moment the princess drew attention to the elegant blade standing in the corner of the room. Saltmuden calmly explained that this sword belonged to him and was his constant companion. Then the insightful mistress realized that this man definitely knows how to skillfully handle cold weapons. Apparently, he was an educated aristocrat with serious knightly experience behind him. And of course, it was extremely interesting for her as the captain of the elite knightly order to know how well this mysterious person owns the art of a sword. For this reason, Schiller directly asked this stranger to fight her in an honest duel. Saltmuden again courteously refused, explaining that he does not like to fight with those who are obviously weaker than him. The princess was amazed that such words were spoken to her. But perhaps he really did not know that she was a real master of the sword with the corresponding reputation. Previously, many foreign male knights refused to fight her only because she was a woman, but making her agree to battle was quite simple. Therefore, the princess simply laughed mockingly, hinting that Saltmuden, perhaps, was corny afraid to lose her. And the hero was given to this obvious provocation. Immediately taking his blade, he invited the girl to go out for a duel. He did not like such impudent persons. He had to teach her a good lesson. Soon, already on the open air street, the lady officially warned that the fight would be carried out according to the strict rules of the Knight's Code. The winds are the one who will be able to completely suppress the enemy with his blocked aura. At this critical moment, Jiran was worried that Salt should not be forgotten. It was still the princess of the influential kingdom of Kai. If it hurts seriously, it can develop into a serious diplomatic problem. Saltmuden understood this perfectly, so he promised not to attack her too cruelly. In fact, the lady saw many similar arrogant men, but all of them eventually bowed her knees, recognizing her complete defeat. She was already in a pleasant anticipation, wanting to see how the hero's face was distorted from shock. As soon as they declared the beginning of the battle, the princess immediately rushed forward, rapidly approaching the enemy. She tried to attack him with a powerful attack, but Saltmuden with amazing ease evaded a rushing attack. Of course, she was amazed. The man did not bluff at all, he was really strong. The warrior managed to easily block her unexpected blow, but the princess did not give up, continuing to attack again and again. However, all attempts were unsuccessful. The hero just gracefully evaded for some time without taking any response attacks. The girl herself was amazed with such minimal movements and without any visible efforts. The guy reflected all her honed attacks. Although she was a recognized master of the sword, Schiller could honestly admit one thing. This mysterious man was really incredibly talented. The Baron was amazed that this princess had an extremely rough and merciless technique. Just like the master of the school's spear school, who has reached the level of transformation, he understood, if such a confrontation continues, everything around will be destroyed by their destructive blows. Therefore, both fighters decided to finish the duel with one decisive blow. As a result, the hero managed to catch the mistress, grabbing her neck and hitting the ground. Then he put the tip of the sword directly to her throat. At this moment, Salt Mudon persistently demanded that the girl recognize her defeat. However, the stubborn princess insisted on another round. Jiron desperately tried to smooth out sharp corners, explaining that both were excellent fencers. Therefore, the count invited them to finish this battle and peacefully complete the meal. However, the angry girl warned, if the hero does not agree to a repeated duel, then she will give an official protest to the Kingdom of Drake. From such a threat, not only Aishield, but also Jiron's faces reflected genuine fright. The hero calmly explained that the recognition of defeat is the honor and dignity of true knights, and the actions of the princess were no different from the whims of a spoiled child. Obviously offended by such words, Schiller was sure. Salt Mudon did not understand anything to say this. However, when she was about to attack him, the warrior calmly put the blade to her throat. Then the princess realized. She finally lost. The girl did not even notice the enemy's lightning movement. The hero was simply angry with the fact that the princess treats the man who saved her life. It seemed to him that this spoiled person would never understand. He restrained only because she was a princess. Therefore, the Baron asked her once again to think carefully about which of them he behaved rudely. The mistress herself still could not understand why she lost. Until that moment, Schiller had never lost his position in an honest battle. She remembered vivid memories from childhood when the princess once again brought her mother a gold medal. She again took first place in prestigious fencing competitions. And of course, the mother was immensely glad that she was growing such an amazing daughter. She hoped that Schiller would become even stronger, could protect her younger sister and, of course, the most important thing, would become a living sword of Kai's kingdom. So the princess lived all her life as a weapon, protecting the kingdom and being the person with whom no one dares to contact. She worked all her life to become just such an invincible warrior. Therefore, Schiller passionately wanted to know, who is this mysterious man in front of her? At this moment, the worried Aishield approached the Baron, ready to intervene in the conflict. However, finally Salt Mudon asked that the princess treats her opponents with more caution and respect. After that, the hero turned all his attention to his lover, explaining that they already needed to return to the Carillon tomorrow. Therefore, he proposed to finish the inspection of the sights of the city. That's how these two left, leaving the princess in thought. The hero finally turned to Jiron, asking him to buy him a couple of quality swords. However, the princess detained the count. She wanted to know if the woman was next to the Baron of his wife. Jiron could not explain everything, but made it clear that the girl was a noble person from a noble family. And it seems that the princess was comforted by the fact that the couple was still not officially married. At that moment, she also turned to the moon, rudely ordering her to call a carriage to return to the castle. The mistress herself, leaving the way, thought, since she became a master of the sword, this was the first time she met the enemy stronger than herself. Therefore, Schiller remembered his name for a long time, a blizzard. If there was such a person next to her, perhaps she would have changed a lot for the better. So after returning to the castle, the princess sent her closest associates to find Baron Palatine. But he was found dead in the basement of his own house. The traitor in his hand was clamped with a letter. His family was taken hostage, and he could not do anything else. It was impossible to make out the handwriting in the letter. Perhaps the name of the one who tried to kill the princess was recorded there. Schiller tried to find out who attempted her life, but never found convincing information or evidence. However, there was one influential person whom she seriously suspected of organizing an attempt. Soon, when the girl was resting at her house, they reported to her that the princess had come to her. This was the first heiress of the throne in the kingdom of Kai. Her name was Rowan McMahon. The older sister was sincerely amazed to learn that Baron Palatine was trying to kill the youngest. Schiller calmly explained that the scoundrel poisoned her with poisonous wine, and then settled the building where she was. If one noble man had not saved her, she would probably be dead. At that moment, the sister screamed loudly, demanding that she immediately brought Baron Palatine for reprisal. However, this was not necessary. The girl calmly explained, when she got to him, the traitor was already dead. Perhaps the one who tried to kill her made him shut up forever. At that moment, Princess Rowan rushed to hug Schiller, her dear younger sister. She thought that everything would be in order with her because she was a master of the sword. But the eldest was too careless. However, Rowan promised that now the youngest would be in full security, and she really was insanely happy about this. It was apparently the older sister would be more glad that Schiller died. All evidence indicated that it was the work of Royn's hands. However, the youngest hoped that this was not true, although indirect evidence was significant. It was a pity that the sisters could not return to their cheerful, carefree past. Schiller also wanted to know what the blizzard had done, being in her place. However, suddenly the youngest remembered. This year her sister would go as part of a delegation for the birthday of King Drake. Therefore she, smiling, asked to go with her. Of course, it was completely unlike the younger sister. Usually Schiller did not like to ride such boring events. Then the older sister realized. Most likely the person who saved Schiller was from the kingdom of Drake. Rowan only smiled slyly, realizing that the youngest wants to meet this mysterious man again. However, Schiller began to properly prove that this was not the case at all. Somewhere at that time, 3 days have passed since Salt Moudon, with his lover, returned to the walls of the Carrillo. After the attack of Justin and the situation with Princess Schiller, the location of important objects in the settlement could be discovered by opponents. Therefore, the leaders decided that for public communication with people and other open activities, they will use the old castle, which was used before the construction of White. Just today was the day when Princess Aeshild returned home. This time flew by unnoticed, and during this period really a lot has happened. For example, they learned that soon the attack of hostile forces may begin on them. However, fortunately, today it was amazingly quiet and calm. Jeroen was already waiting for the master to rest a little after deed. He also warned his lord that Princess Schiller could soon begin active actions. Therefore, they should have strengthened defense as soon as possible. In fact, even Aeshild was a little worried about this. And although now she was with her beloved, the girl was still a princess of the kingdom. Aeshild was afraid that what happened could develop into a diplomatic war between states. Salt Moudon understood. In the Central Plains, especially when he ruled an alliance, this happened quite often. Princess Schiller had the proud gaze of a martial artist. If she really is a real master, then he will not just tell anyone about the offensive. However, Salt Moudon asked the mistress not to worry in vain. In fact, he explained everything to Princess Kai, and she was sure that she realized what was about. However, in case something happens to the girl, Schiller conveyed a small surprise. It was an elegant box in which an object called a stone of communication was stored. It allows you to communicate at a great distance without the help of a wizard. Between the kingdom of Drake and the White Castle will now be constant at any time. Therefore, Salt Moudon asked Aeshild not to be shy, and contact him at any time when help would be needed. Soon, having collected all the things, Salt Moudon led his beloved to the carriage. He also warned Aeshild that magical communication was not yet known to the world, so it needs to be used only alone so that no one would get caught. And also, in case Justin does something, the faithful Jake will be next to the princess to protect. Obviously, the girl was amazed that the hero handed her such a valuable subject of personal manufacturing. She felt that Salt Moudon was sincerely good about her. This was evident from his actions and words. Therefore, without hesitation, Aeshild thanked the Baron for everything he did for her. The hero looked around until she disappeared from sight of the bend. His current status was just a baron, and between him and the princess lay a huge social abyss. To become a man worthy of her hand, he had to raise his status in society at all costs. Therefore, the Baron understood. It was time to go where he had long wanted. However, when they came to visit the prisoners of hired killers, they saw that they were all in terrible condition. Seeing Jeroen's anxiety, Salt Moudon explained. All these people were the very murderers who tried to kill him. These were professional killers, which were brought with him by the son of the Duke Justin. Surely Justin himself believed that they were all dead. In fact, the hero locked them without food to check how long they will last. It took about 10 days, and compared to the assassins of the Central Plains, this lacked not only skill, but also survival skills in extreme conditions. However, 2 of the entire group were a plus or minus in an acceptable state. For this reason, the hero asked Jeroen with a storm to bring these guys food. Salt itself. Moudon understood that it would take a lot of time to make these people suitable for use as fighters. However, first of all, he gave them to eat so that they would not die in prison. At that moment, the Count decided to find out why the hero left these killers alive. The Baron was thinking about making these people his personal detachment of assassins. Obviously, Jeroen thought that the hero was going to use a detachment of killers before Kai's kingdom attacks them. And perhaps, together with the wyvern detachment and the personal detachment of the killers, he wanted to start an uprising in the kingdom itself. It was completely incomprehensible by the master's face what this mysterious person was thinking about.